Let him handle it himself. Let him handle himself taking care of him. I'm done taking care of. Caldwell's voice sliced through the master bedroom with the kind of polished cruelty that did not need to rise to be felt. It was calm, controlled, and final. Ethan looked up at her slowly. "Monica," Ethan said, fighting to keep the tremor out of his voice and failing. "Please don't leave me like this." She stood near the foot of the bed in a fitted ivory blouse and tailored slacks. One hand resting against her hip, the other holding a thick folder of his medical reports as though it were one more burden she resented carrying. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "Every night it's the same thing." His right hand hovered over the spoon. He tried to close his fingers around it firmly, but Parkinson's answered before willpower could. The tremor ran through his wrist, sharp and relentless. He pressed his elbow against the blanket over his legs, trying to steady the movement. "I'm not asking for much," he said. "Just stay. Sit with me." Her laugh held no warmth. "Sit with you while you spill half of dinner on yourself and pretend this is manageable." His jaw tightened. 2 years ago, Ethan Caldwell was a man who could shake the market with a single phone call, not someone lying helpless in bed, pleading with his wife not to walk away while struggling to lift a spoon to his own mouth. "Monica," he said again, quieter now, more nakedly than he had intended. "Please." She looked at him the way people sometimes looked at storms on the news. Sorry it existed. Glad it was happening to somebody else. Ethan lowered the spoon into the soup. His hand trembled harder. He focused on the bowl, on the edge of the spoon, on the simple task in front of him. Lift, hold, bring it to the mouth. A child could do it. A healthy man did not even notice he was doing it. Ethan got halfway. Then the tremor surged. The spoon knocked hard against the porcelain. Tomato soup splashed over the blanket across the front of his pale blue shirt and onto the folder Monica had left near his knees. A streak of red spread over one page where his name sat at the top beside the latest specialist's notes. For a second, no one moved. Ethan stared at the mess. His throat closed with humiliation. "I didn't mean to." Monica stepped forward, snatched up the file, and threw it at his chest. The folder hit him, and slid sideways across the damp blanket, papers loosening at the corners. "Do you know what these say?" she snapped. "Do you even understand that your condition is getting worse? Every report says the same thing. The tremors are worse. The stiffness is worse. Nothing they've tried has improved enough. Nothing is working." He looked down at the papers soaked with soup, then up at her. "That doesn't mean you get to abandon me." She recoiled at the word as if he had accused her of something vulgar. "Abandon you, Ethan? I have stood in hospitals, sat through consultations, memorized medication schedules, canceled vacations, and rearranged my entire life around this disease. And for what?" His fingers twitched helplessly against the blanket. "For me, for your husband." Monica's expression hardened. "I didn't sign up to become a full-time nurse to a man who refuses to accept what he's become." The sentence landed with a force the folder had not. Before he could answer, she turned toward the door and called, "Marlene." The house manager appeared almost immediately with 2 staff members behind her. They all stopped when they saw the spilled soup, the scattered reports. Ethan sitting rigid and redate against the pillows. Monica did not soften. "Take this away," she said. "And Mr. Caldwell's dinner. Right now." Marlene hesitated just long enough for Ethan to notice, then lowered her eyes. "Yes, Mrs. Caldwell. From now on," Monica continued, voice clipped and precise. "If he insists on handling it himself, let him. I'm done cleaning up after this." Ethan looked at her as though the room had suddenly lost its air. "Monica, don't do this." But she already had. She picked up her phone, adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, and walked out without looking back. The younger maid moved first, reaching for the tray. Another began gathering the damp medical papers one by one. Marlene stepped closer to Ethan with the careful expression of someone paid to remain composed in rooms where dignity was bleeding out by the minute. "Sir," she said softly, "let me help you change your shirt." "No." The word came out raw. "Leave it." The tray was lifted from his lap. Anyway, the spoon, still wet with soup, clanked against the bowl as it went. One of the staff took the folder. Another folded the stained napkin inward so the mess disappeared from sight. That, Ethan thought bitterly, was how this house handled suffering now. Not by easing it, by removing the evidence. "Would you like tea later, sir?" Marlene asked. He almost laughed. "No." She nodded, and within moments they were gone. Ethan heard them moving down the upstairs hallway. Then toward the back stairs that led to the kitchen level. Their voices were low at first, but the house carried sounds strangely at night. She really meant it this time. "Well, did you see that tray? He barely got one bite. It's awful. It's getting worse. That's what it is. Hush. No, I'm serious, Doctor. Hayes said, his hands are shaking more every week. And Mrs. Caldwell's tired of it, wouldn't you be? Their footsteps faded downward. In the service hallway next to the kitchen, Annie Bennett sat on a narrow bench, swinging one sneakered foot as she waited for her mother to finish her late cleaning upstairs. She looked up as the staff came down the stairs with the tray and the file. He dropped it all again. One woman muttered. Mrs. Caldwell said, stop the meal. Let him handle it himself. As if he can. Poor man. Poor. He's a billionaire. Money doesn't hold a spoon. A few of them noticed Annie then and fell silent. One offered a stiff smile before carrying the tray into the kitchen. But the words had already landed. Annie sat very still. Upstairs, Ethan sat alone in the vast bedroom, while the stain on his shirt cooled against his skin. The light seemed too soft for what had just happened. On the nightstand beside him sat his evening pills and a full glass of water. No one came back for either. The silence settled over the room in layers. Down in the service hall, Annie slid off the bench. She glanced toward the kitchen where the clatter of dishes and low voices covered small sounds. Then she looked toward the back staircase. Her mother had told her not to wander. But upstairs was a man everyone kept talking about in sad, sharp whispers. A man who could not eat his dinner without everyone turning away. Annie bit her lower lip, then started moving. She climbed the stairs slowly, one careful step at a time, her small hand gliding along the polished banister. At the end of the corridor, one bedroom door stood partly open. Annie hesitated, then crept toward it, light-footed and curious, not yet knowing that by the time she stepped across that threshold, the whole life of the man inside would begin to change. Annie slipped through the half-open doorway and paused, her small fingers curling around the edge of the frame. For a moment, she only stood there, letting her eyes adjust to the soft amber light in the room. Ethan Caldwell sat propped against a stack of pillows in the center of that loneliness. Without the dinner tray across his lap, he looked less like the powerful man people whispered about downstairs and more like someone who had been left behind after the rest of the house had moved on. The front of his shirt was stained with soup. A few damp medical papers lay near the blanket over his legs as though even his illness had been dropped carelessly and forgotten. His right hand trembled on top of the bedspread in a steady, relentless rhythm. He turned when he heard her breath. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. His voice was not mean. It was worn thin. Annie stepped farther into the room. "I heard them talking downstairs." He looked away toward the windows where night had already settled over the grounds. "You shouldn't listen to grown people gossip. They weren't whispering very good," she said simply. That almost made his mouth move. Not quite into a smile, but toward one. It vanished quickly. Annie watched him for a few more seconds. She took another step closer. "Are you sad?" Ethan let out a breath that sounded heavier than the question deserved. "That's one way to put it. Because of your hands." He looked down at them. "Because of a lot of things." Annie moved carefully over the thick rug until she stood beside the bed. "I heard them say you didn't eat." His jaw tightened. "They say a lot." She nodded, taking that in with the seriousness of a child trying to understand a world that often made no sense. Then she asked softly and without fear, "Did everybody leave?" For the first time, Ethan met her eyes fully. "Yes," he said after a pause. "Everybody leaves. Even your wife?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Especially my wife." "That's not nice," Annie said. "No," Ethan replied quietly. "It isn't." He looked away again, his voice dropping lower, as if admitting the next thing cost him more than he wanted a child to see. "When you get sick long enough, people stop looking at you like a person. They start looking at you like a problem, something difficult, something messy. And after a while," he swallowed. "After a while, everybody turns their back on you." Annie listened without interrupting. She did not rush to fill the silence with bright little noises the way some children might have. Instead, she reached up and rested her hand very gently on the blanket near his arm. "I'm not turning my back on you," she said. Something in Ethan's expression broke at those words. He looked at her small hand, then at her face. "You don't even know me." "I know you're hungry," Annie said. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that remind us kindness still matters. The honesty of that made him blink. She glanced around the room and saw a small side table near the window. On it sat a covered dish the staff must have forgotten to take. Along with a spoon and a folded napkin, Annie moved toward it before he could stop her. "Annie, you don't have to do that," She lifted the silver cover with both hands and found a small bowl of applesauce and a few soft bites of mashed potatoes left in a side dish. "But I want to." He should have told her no, but his body betrayed him in ways dignity could no longer hide. His hand trembled against the blanket. His stomach was empty, his heart was tired, and this child, unlike everyone else in the house, had come closer instead of stepping away. Annie carried the bowl back to the bed carefully. She climbed onto the upholstered bench beside it so she could reach more easily, then picked up the spoon and looked at him with solemn concentration. "It's okay," she said. "I can help." Ethan exhaled through his nose and closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, the pride was still there, but it was losing the fight. "All right," he said. Annie scooped a small spoonful and held it up. "Open." He obeyed. The applesauce was cool and sweet. A small thing, hardly a meal at all, but the first bite hit him with an ache he had not expected. Annie waited until he swallowed, then smiled in quiet approval. "See," she said, "you can do it." He almost corrected her. She fed him another spoonful, then another. Between bites, she watched his shaking hand with open concern, not disgust. When a bit of applesauce slipped from the spoon and touched the corner of his mouth, she immediately reached for the folded napkin, leaned in, and wiped it away with slow, careful movements. "Sorry," Ethan muttered automatically, humiliated by reflex. Annie shook her head. "You don't have to say sorry for that." He looked at her, startled. Adults said sorry for inconvenience. Staff said sorry for mistakes. Patients said sorry for needing too much. Somewhere along the line, he had started apologizing simply for being difficult to witness. But Annie did not treat the spilled food like a disgrace. She treated it like something that needed cleaning, no more shameful than rainwater on a floor. She offered him another spoonful. This time, his hand jerked suddenly as if he were trying to help, and the spoon rattled against the bowl. A soft lump of applesauce dropped onto the blanket over his legs. "Oh," Annie said. Ethan's face tightened at once. "There you see." But Annie only set the bowl down, picked up the napkin again, and carefully cleaned the blanket with small patient dabs. "It's fine," she said. "My mama says eating messy is still eating." That pulled a strange sound out of him. Half-breath, half-broken laugh. He had not heard laughter in his own room in so long that it startled them both. Annie brightened. "That's better. What is that noise? It sounds better than being sad." He looked at her for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice was rougher than before. "You really shouldn't be this kind to strangers. I'm not scared of you." "No," he said, "I noticed." She lifted another spoonful. He opened his mouth again, and she fed him with the steady seriousness of someone performing a very important job. Then, just as Annie was lifting another bite toward him, footsteps sounded sharply in the hallway. High heels. The bedroom door swung wider without warning. Monica Caldwell stood on the threshold, one hand still on the knob, her expression frozen between irritation and disbelief. Her gaze moved first to Ethan, then to Annie, perched beside the bed with the bowl and spoon in her hands. Then to the napkin spread across the blanket where she had been wiping away the spilled food. For one suspended second, no one spoke. Annie turned, still holding the spoon. Ethan stiffened against the pillows, and Monica, who had walked away from her husband's humiliation as though it were beneath her notice, now stood staring at the only person in the house who had chosen not to leave him hungry. For a long second, Monica Caldwell said nothing. She stood framed in the doorway in the same ivory blouse she had worn earlier, one hand still curled around the polished brass knob, her expression sharpened by disbelief. Her eyes moved slowly from Annie's small fingers wrapped around the spoon to the bowl balanced on the edge of the blanket, then to the faint smear of applesauce Annie had just wiped from Ethan's shirt with the folded napkin resting in her lap. The silence in the room changed shape. It was no longer the wounded quiet Ethan had known before Annie came in. It had become something tighter, more dangerous. "What exactly is this?" Monica asked at last. Her voice was low, but the softness in it was the kind that made staff nervous and waiters forget their trays. Annie, who had not yet learned all the warning signs of adult cruelty, only turned on the bench to look at her. "He was hungry," she said simply. Monica's gaze dropped to the child as though noticing for the first time that compassion could look this small and this out of place. "And who told you that you were allowed in here?" Annie glanced at Ethan, then back at Monica. "Nobody. That much is obvious." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, the bowl on the blanket, the spoon in Annie's hand, the stain still drying on his shirt. All of it suddenly seemed too intimate, too exposed beneath Monica's stare. A few minutes ago, he had been too worn down to resist kindness. Now shame rushed back in with full force, sharp and hot and humiliating. But it was no longer only shame for himself. It was shame that this child who had walked toward him when everyone else stepped away should have to stand beneath Monica's contempt. She was helping me, Ethan said. Monica looked at him as though he had said something absurd. Helping you? Yes, with applesauce. Her laugh came thin and brittle. So, this is where we are now. Annie held the spoon a little lower, but did not set it down. He didn't eat dinner, she said, as if Monica might have missed the important part, and his hands were shaking. Annie, Ethan said quietly, not because she had done anything wrong, but because instinct told him to shield her now, even if he did not yet know how. The sound of hurried footsteps came from the hall before Monica could answer. A moment later, Rosa Bennett appeared in the doorway, breathless. One hand pressed to her chest. Her eyes found Annie first, then the bed, then Monica, and the color drained from her face. "Oh my lord," Rosa whispered. "Annie." The child turned toward her mother with no trace of guilt, only mild surprise. "Mama, he was hungry." Rosa crossed the room so quickly she almost stumbled on the rug. "I told you to stay downstairs." Her voice shook with panic. "I told you not to wander." Annie climbed off the bench at once, still clutching the napkin. "I know, but they said it doesn't matter what they said." Monica stepped aside from the doorway and folded her arms. "Apparently, your daughter has made herself very comfortable in private rooms." Rosa straightened, her hands trembling now for a reason entirely different from Ethan's. "Mrs. Caldwell, I am so sorry. I don't know how she got up here. I only turned my back for a minute. She walked," Monica replied quite confidently, "from what I can see." Rosa reached for Annie's shoulder and drew her gently closer. "It won't happen again." Monica's eyes narrowed on the bowl, the spoon, the napkin in Annie's hand. "No, it won't." Ethan heard what lay inside those 4 words. So did Rosa. In a house like this, dismissal never needed to be announced directly. It often arrived hidden in tone, in timing, in the sentence that came before the actual sentence. "Monica," Ethan said. She did not look at him. "I think we have been more than generous with boundaries in this house, Monica." This time she turned and there was open irritation in her face. "Now you," Ethan drew in a careful breath. His hand twitched once against the blanket. "Do not take this out on them." Rosa lowered her eyes immediately as if hoping invisibility might still save her. Annie looked from one adult to the other, trying to understand why helping someone eat could make the room feel colder. Monica stared at Ethan in disbelief. "You are defending this?" "Yes, she disobeyed house rules. Her mother lost track of her. And I walk in to find a staff member's child feeding my husband in our bedroom like this as some kind of charity ward." "No," Ethan said more firmly now. "You walked in and found the only person in this house who made sure I didn't go to bed hungry." The sentence landed hard enough to stop the room. Rosa looked up despite herself. Annie stayed very still. Monica's expression changed, not softened, but sharpened into something much uglier because it was quieter. "That is not a child's responsibility." "It shouldn't have been," Ethan replied. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Ethan could feel the old balance of their marriage shifting somewhere under the words. Monica had spent months speaking over him, around him, for him. Tonight for the first time in a long while. He had interrupted the arrangement. Rosa swallowed. "Mr. Caldwell, I truly am sorry. Annie didn't mean any harm." "I know she didn't." Monica's head turned toward Rosa at once. "Take your daughter downstairs." "Yes, ma'am." Annie looked up at Ethan, still holding the napkin, but he didn't finish. Rosa touched her hair lightly. "Annie." The child hesitated, then held the napkin out toward Ethan as though returning something important. He took it with a hand that would not quite obey him. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Annie's face tightened with concern when she saw the tremor up close again. "I can come back later," she offered softly. Something in Ethan's chest pulled so sharply it might as well have been pain. Rosa's eyes widened in alarm, but Monica let out a humorless breath. "No, you cannot." Annie looked confused. "Why?" "Because this is not your place." The words hung there, larger than the room, larger than the child they were meant for. Ethan saw the faint change in Annie's face. The way children tried to stand still when they realized an adult had just drawn a line around them. Before Rosa could usher her away, Ethan spoke. "She was kind to me." Monica did not bother hiding her impatience. "Kindness does not erase impropriety. Neither does wealth erase cruelty." The words were out before he could consider the consequences. For one stunned second, even Rosa forgot to breathe. Monica's face lost all expression. That was always when she looked most dangerous. "You're tired," she said, and clearly not thinking clearly. "No," Ethan answered. "I am thinking very clearly." He could see the impulse in her to continue to cut deeper to remind him who still moved freely through the world and who remained in bed with medicine beside the lamp. But Rosa was standing there, Annie at her side, and Monica's cruelty had always preferred private audiences when it came dressed as refinement. She turned toward the door with rigid control. "Take the child out now." Rosa did not need telling twice. She guided Annie toward the hallway, one protective hand between the girl's shoulders. At the threshold, Annie twisted around just enough to look back. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell," she said. The room seemed to hold itself still, waiting. "Good night, Annie," Ethan replied. Rosa led her away. Their footsteps softened down the corridor and disappeared toward the back stairs. Monica remained for another moment, standing with all the chilled poise of a woman who had been challenged and would not soon forget it. Then, without another word, she left too. The bedroom fell quiet again, but not in the same way as before. The quiet now was fuller, altered. On the blanket beside Ethan, sat the nearly empty bowl Annie had carried to him, the spoon resting at an angle inside it. He looked at the last pale streaks of applesauce clinging to the sides and felt the strangest mix of emotions rise inside him. Embarrassment, gratitude, grief, and something dangerously close to relief. Someone had seen him tonight and had not turned away. Downstairs in the service corridor, Annie would likely be getting a frightened whisper from her mother about rules, about jobs, about not wandering into rooms where people like them were not supposed to belong. Ethan knew that world. He had built too much of it himself. Order, boundaries, separation, the careful architecture of who entered through the front door, and who disappeared through the back, and yet the only mercy he had been shown all evening had come up the servant stairs in pink sneakers. He leaned back against the pillows and closed his eyes for a moment. His hand was still shaking. The disease had not eased. Monica had not changed. His dignity had not been restored by some miraculous act, but the emptiness of the room no longer felt absolute. On the nightstand, the glass of water caught the lamp's glow. Beside it sat the evening pills he had not taken yet. Ethan opened his eyes and stared at them for a long time. Then he reached for the water with a hand that trembled hard enough to slash it against the rim, because downstairs there was a child who had looked at him as if he were still a man worth feeding. And for the first time in many months, that seemed like reason enough not to give up on the rest of the night. Rosa did not speak until they reached the service stairs. Her grip on Annie's shoulder was not rough, but it was firmer than usual, the kind that told a child trouble had arrived. Wearing grown-up shoes, Annie walked beside her in silence, glancing back only once toward the long upstairs hall before the turn of the staircase swallowed it from sight. Down below, the kitchen lights glowed warm against the polished stone floor, and the ordinary sounds of the house had resumed as if nothing important had happened at all. A dishwasher hummed, someone stacked plates, a cabinet closed softly. In wealthy homes, Annie was beginning to understand. Even the cruelest moments disappeared quickly behind routine when they reached the service corridor. Rosa guided her onto the narrow bench where she had been told to wait in the first place. Then she knelt in front of her daughter and took both of Annie's hands into her own. "What were you thinking?" Rosa whispered. Annie looked at her mother's face and saw fear there before anger. That made the answer feel more important. "He was hungry," she said. Rosa closed her eyes briefly as though the simplicity of it hurt. "Baby, I know what you thought. I know you meant to help. I did help, yes." Rosa's voice softened for a second, then tightened again. "But you cannot just go walking into people's private rooms in a house like this. Do you understand me? Not upstairs. Not ever." Annie frowned. "Why?" "Because there are rules," Rosa thought. "Because some people get forgiven and some people get fired. Because kindness means one thing when it comes from a woman in pearls and something very different when it comes from a little black girl whose mother cleans up after dinner. But children deserve truths they could carry, not burdens too heavy for their age. Because this is where I work," Rosa said carefully. "And work is how we pay rent and buy groceries and keep the lights on. If Mrs. Caldwell thinks I can't follow the rules, she can send me home and tell me not to come back." Annie's expression changed at once. "Because of me." Rosa hated the guilt that entered so quickly into a child's face. She touched Annie's cheek. "No, not because of you being bad. You weren't bad, but sometimes doing a kind thing at the wrong time in the wrong place still causes trouble." Annie lowered her eyes to their joined hands. "He said everybody leaves." Rosa went very still. She had not meant to ask any more questions. In truth, she had not wanted to know what had passed between Ethan Caldwell and her daughter in that room. The less a woman in her position knew, the safer she usually was. But there had been something in Ethan's voice upstairs when he defended Annie, something stripped raw enough to cut through all the polish of the house. He told you that? Rosa asked quietly. Annie nodded. He said, when people get sick long enough, everybody turns their back on them. Rosa sat back, on her heels and looked down the corridor toward the kitchen doors. A server passed through carrying folded napkins and did not so much as glance their way. In this house, private suffering traveled by rumor long before it ever arrived as compassion. She had seen enough over the past months to know Ethan was not exaggerating. The man had not become gentle under illness. Power did not evaporate that neatly. He could still be curt, still proud, still impossible on the wrong day. But that was not the same as deserving abandonment. Too many people in large houses learn to confuse inconvenience with character. Once a person needed more than they could offer gracefully, judgment stepped in to replace mercy. What happened in there? Rosa asked. Annie brightened at once, relieved to be telling a story instead of receiving a warning. He had apple sauce on the little table and I got the spoon and helped him eat. His hand was shaking and some fell on the blanket. So, I wiped it up and then Mrs. Caldwell came back and got mad. Rosa let out a slow breath through her nose. A part of her wanted to march straight upstairs and apologize again, more thoroughly, more strategically, perhaps to Marlene this time, instead of Monica. Another part of her, smaller but harder, remembered the sight of Ethan in that bed, the stain on his shirt, the bowl in Annie's hands, Monica standing there with all the warmth of a closed gate. Rosa had spent her life recognizing the precise tone respectable people used when they wanted to be cruel without appearing cruel. Monica Caldwell spoke it fluently. Listen to me, Rosa said. You were trying to be good. I know that, but you have to stay close to me the rest of the night. All right. Annie hesitated. Can I see him tomorrow? No. The answer came too fast, sharpened by fear. Annie's mouth fell open. Rosa softened immediately, but not enough to take it back. For now, no, she amended. We are going to keep our heads down and finish our work and go home. Annie leaned against the wall behind the bench. But he didn't look mean. Rosa almost smiled despite herself. I didn't say he was mean. He looked lonely. That word landed closer to the truth than most adults in the house would have dared speak out loud. Rosa rose to her feet and glanced toward the kitchen, where Marlene Pike stood speaking in low tones to one of the evening servers. Marlene looked up just long enough to catch Rosa's eye, then motioned her over. Rosa's stomach tightened at once. Stay right here, she told Annie. I will. Rosa crossed the corridor and stepped into the kitchen where the bright overhead lights made everything look harsher, cleaner, more official. Marlene dismissed the server with a nod and turned toward Rosa, her expression professionally neutral. Is she all right? Marlene asked, meaning Annie. Yes, ma'am. Marlene folded her hands in front of her apron. Mrs. Caldwell was very displeased. Rosa swallowed. I understand. She is not asking for your dismissal tonight. Relief came so suddenly. Rosa nearly showed it. Nearly. She kept her face still. But Marlene continued. She expects this not to happen again. No wandering. No unsupervised time upstairs. No contact with the family unless specifically instructed. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am. Marlene's eyes flicked past Rosa toward the service bench where Annie sat, swinging her feet again. Quieter now. Your daughter meant well. The small kindness in that sentence startled Rosa more than the warning had. She did. Rosa replied softly. Marlene lowered her voice, meaning well doesn't always protect people in houses like this. Rosa gave one slow nod. She did not need the lesson explained. When she returned to Annie, the child looked up at once. Are we going home? Soon. Annie stood and slipped her hand into her mother's. Is he all right? Rosa looked toward the ceiling, toward the floors above them, toward the bedroom where Ethan Caldwell was likely sitting in another long stretch of silence. I don't know, she said honestly. They stayed another hour. Rosa polished the last sideboard in the breakfast room, straightened the mudroom shelves, and signed off on a supply checklist Marlene left near the sink. Annie sat with a coloring book and a short pencil from Rosa's purse. Unusually quiet, filling in the petals of a flower with careful pink strokes. Every now and then, she looked toward the back stairs as if listening for something. Outside, the October air had turned crisp by the time they finally stepped onto the rear driveway. Rosa's old sedan waited under a spill of yellow security light, its paint dulled by years and weather. Annie climbed into the back seat without being told, hugging her little cardigan closed while Rosa slid behind the wheel and sat for a moment with both hands resting on it. The engine did not start on the first try. It coughed, shuddered, then caught on the second. Rosa exhaled and pulled away from the servants' entrance, the estate shrinking in the rear-view mirror as they rolled down the long private drive. The front of the Caldwell house glowed in perfect stillness against the dark, all stone and symmetry and money. It looked from a distance like the kind of place that kept pain hidden out of principle. Annie leaned forward between the front seats. Mama, yes. Why was Mrs. Caldwell so mad? Rosa kept her eyes on the road. Some people don't like to be reminded of what they should have done themselves. Annie considered that. I just fed him. I know. After a few minutes, the roads changed from private curves lined with bare branch trees to quieter town streets and modest storefronts gone dark for the night. Annie's voice came again, sleepier now. Do you think he ate the rest after we left? Rosa tightened her hands on the wheel. She thought of Ethan's face when Annie had said good night. The way his voice had changed around the child's name. She thought of the bowl nearly empty on the blanket and of a man too young to sound that defeated. I hope so, she said. But even as she spoke, she knew hope was a thin thing in a house where dinner could be cancelled with a sentence. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Ethan Caldwell had not gone to sleep. He had taken his medication and changed into a clean shirt with difficulty and no assistance. The bowl Annie had used was gone now, collected at some point by a quiet hand that never knocked, but the napkin she had folded and given back to him still lay on the bedside table beside the lamp. He had not asked for it to remain there. He had not touched it either. Yet he kept looking at it as if the plain square of cloth had become proof that the evening had happened exactly as he remembered that a child had walked into the ruins of his pride and behaved as though nothing about him was too broken to deserve care. Down the hall, he heard the distant opening and closing of Monica's dressing room drawers. He did not call for her. He did not expect her. Instead, he looked once more at the napkin, then toward the dark window, where his reflection hovered faintly over the night outside. For the first time in months, the silence around him did not feel empty. It felt interrupted, and somewhere deep beneath the weight of illness, humiliation, and the cold machinery of his marriage, Ethan sensed something fragile and unfamiliar beginning to return. Not strength, not yet, but the memory of warmth. The next afternoon, the Caldwell estate looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The graystone facade stood clean against a pale autumn sky. The hedges were trimmed with military precision. The fountain in the circular drive spilled water in a steady polished stream, indifferent to weather, illness, or marriage. To the world passing beyond the iron gates, it was the home of a man who had everything. To the people inside, it had become a house where every sound carried, and every silence meant something. Rosa Bennett arrived 10 minutes early. She did that whenever she was nervous. And today, nervousness had followed her from the moment she woke. Annie had asked twice before breakfast whether she was coming to work again, and Rosa had answered both times with the same careful firmness. Yes, but only because there was no one else to watch her for the afternoon, and only because Annie was going to stay close. Stay quiet, and not wander. Annie had promised with both hands raised as though taking an oath in church. Now, as Rosa signed in through the service entrance, she felt the eyes on her before anyone spoke. Not dramatic stares, not open hostility, just the tiny shift in the room that said everyone already knew. The kitchen assistant, who normally chatted about gas prices, gave her a tight smile and turned back to the dishwasher. One of the wait staff nodded, but did not linger. Somewhere near the pantry, someone lowered a voice the second Rosa walked in. That was how houses like this punished people before any punishment became official. They made the air itself aware of you. Annie stood tucked close to Rosa's side in a clean yellow sweater. Her hair parted neatly into braids Rosa had redone that morning. She looked around with bright, curious eyes, but she stayed where she was told. For now, Marlene Pike emerged from the hall with a clipboard in hand. Her expression was professional, unreadable. Rosa, ma'am. Marlene's gaze flicked briefly to Annie, then back. You'll be on the east wing first, linen closet inventory, then the upstairs sitting room and guest corridor. After that, the silver in the formal dining room. Yes, ma'am. Marlene lowered her voice. Mrs. Caldwell is in the city until dinner. Mr. Caldwell is staying in his suite today. Rosa heard the message inside the message. There would be no scene if everyone followed the rules. Understood, she said. Annie squeezed her hand once. Rosa looked down and saw at once that the child was already listening harder than she should. The problem with children was not that they disobeyed because they were wild. Often they disobeyed because they cared too much. Rosa led her toward the laundry room at the back of the service hall, a warm place lined with shelves of folded towels, labeled baskets, and the clean scent of detergent. She set Annie up at the small utility table with crayons, paper, crackers, and a juice box. You remember what I said? Annie nodded solemnly. I stay here and I don't go upstairs. And Annie sighed because the list was getting long. And I don't bother nobody. Rosa almost smiled. Anybody. That too. Rosa crouched and adjusted the collar of Annie's sweater. Baby, I mean it today. I know. Do you? Annie's face softened. You don't want to lose your job. Rosa pressed her lips together. There it was again. That quick little understanding children were never supposed to have to grow. That's right. Annie leaned closer and whispered. But he was hungry. Rosa closed her eyes for a second. Not today. She rose before Annie could say more and went to work. For the first hour, the house behaved. Rosa counted sheets, stacked fresh pillowcases, dusted the high, narrow tables in the upstairs corridor, and wiped fingerprints from mirrored frames no one had touched in months. She moved with the efficiency of habit, but her mind kept circling the same questions. Had Ethan said anything after she left? Had Monica complained further? Had Marlene defended her, even a little? And beneath all of that, harder to admit, another thought returned again and again. Had he eaten anything after Annie was taken away? At 3, Rosa was polishing the brass lamp in the upstairs sitting room when she heard a voice behind her. Your daughter has a good heart. She turned so fast she nearly dropped the cloth. Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway to the adjoining hall. He was not in bed. That startled her first. He wore dark trousers and a charcoal sweater instead of a dress shirt. And though his posture carried the stiffness of effort, he was standing with one hand braced lightly against the doorframe. The tremor in his right hand was visible even from across the room, small but insistent. He looked paler in daylight than he had the night before, but more awake somehow, as if something had shifted inside him and had not yet settled back into place. Mr. Caldwell, Rosa said at once, lowering her eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. That's because you were working. She straightened, cloth still in her hand. Would you like me to call someone? No. He took one measured step into the room. It was impossible not to notice how deliberate the movement was. How much concentration it cost him to cross a simple threshold. Power looked different when illness moved into it. It became quieter, more expensive in ways money could not reverse. Rosa waited. Ethan looked toward the polished window glass, then back to her. I meant what I said last night. She knew at once what he was referring to. But caution made her pretend otherwise. Sir, your daughter helped me when no one else did. His voice remained even, though weariness lived in it. I won't have her punished for that. Rosa tightened her hold on the cloth. That was kind of you to say. It was the truth. The room fell still. She had worked in enough wealthy homes to know truth was not their favorite currency. Courtesy, image, timing, discretion, those things mattered. Truth often arrived late and was not welcomed when it came. Yet Ethan stood there offering it without performance. She shouldn't have gone upstairs, Rosa said carefully. I know that. No, he replied. She shouldn't have needed to. The line hit somewhere deeper than Rosa expected. For one brief moment, she let herself look directly at him. Really, look, not at the title, not at the money, not at the man employers described in short, polished sentences, but at the person in front of her. He looked younger than his silence, too young for the exhaustion around his eyes, too young for the defeated note she had heard in him last night, too young to be spoken of downstairs, as though he were already half absent. Sir, she said softer now. Annie doesn't always understand boundaries. Maybe that's why she still understands kindness. Before Rosa could answer, footsteps sounded in the hall. Ethan's expression changed at once, composure settling back over him like a coat. Marlene appeared carrying a tablet and paused when she saw them. Mr. Caldwell. Her tone was respectful and cautious in equal measure. Dr. Hayes called. He can move your appointment to Friday if that works better. It doesn't work better, Ethan said. But Friday is fine, Marlene nodded. Then looked to Rosa. The dining room silver won't polish itself. Yes, ma'am. Ethan stepped aside so Rosa could pass. As she moved toward the door, he said without looking directly at her. Is Annie here today? Rosa hesitated. Yes, sir. In the laundry room, he gave the smallest nod. Good. There was no reason that one word should have changed her whole afternoon, but it did. By 4:30, the news had spread through the service level. It always did. Mr. Caldwell had spoken to Rosa alone upstairs. Mr. Caldwell had asked about the child. Mr. Severus Cell. Mr. Caldwell had asked about the child. Caldwell had not forgotten. Rosa heard the whispers while polishing forks in the pantry alcove. Maybe he's attached. It was one bowl of applesauce. That's all it takes with lonely people. Well, Mrs. Caldwell won't like it. She already doesn't. One woman laughed under her breath. Can you imagine a billionaire waiting on a little girl? Rosa kept polishing. The silver reflected her hands in warped fragments. She had spent enough years in other people's houses to know that gossip often said more about the speaker than the subject. Still, each word tightened the knot under her ribs. Annie was a child. A child with a tender heart and no understanding yet of how dangerous tenderness could become when Ed crossed money, class, and race in the wrong direction. At 5 o'clock, Marlene sent Rosa to collect Annie before the dinner prep picked up. Rosa found her in the laundry room exactly where she had left her, except now the paper in front of her held a drawing and crayon. A large square room, a bed, a bowl, and a stick figure man with one very shaky hand. Rosa sat beside her. "What's that, Mr. Caldwell's room? And what's this?" she asked, pointing to the round shape near the man. "Applesauce." Of course it was. Annie looked up. "Did you see him?" Rosa should have said, "No. Something simple, safe, finished." Instead, she said, "Yes." Annie's eyes widened. Was he hungry? Rosa let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "That seems to be the only question you care about." "Well, I don't know." Annie considered that. Then, with the confidence of a child solving a straightforward problem, she stood up and dusted crayon bits from her sweater. "Then, I should ask him." Rosa caught her wrist gently before she could take a step. "No, but Mama." "No." Rosa's voice sharpened enough to stop her. Then she softened it at once. "Baby, listen to me. Mr. Caldwell is not a school friend, and this is not our home. You cannot keep going to him every time you worry." Annie's mouth turned down, "Even if nobody else does." The question took Rosa a moment to answer because it was too close to one she asked herself in quieter words. Before she could speak, Marlene's voice came from the hall. "Rosa, the supper tray is going up." Both of them looked up. One of the kitchen staff passed the open doorway carrying a tray covered with silver lids. Behind him came another with a water glass in the evening medication case. Annie watched them go by with grave attention. Rosa felt rather than saw the decision forming in her daughter. "Mama," Annie said very softly, "do you think he can hold the spoon today?" Rosa rose to her feet. "Annie." But the child was still looking at the retreating tray, and in her face there was no mischief at all. Only concern, only memory, only the dangerous beginning of devotion. By the time the dinner tray disappeared into the upstairs corridor, the whole lower level of the Caldwell estate seemed to inhale at once. Rosa felt it in the kitchen before anyone said a word. It was in the brief glance the pantry girl gave Annie, in the way one of the wait staff slowed just enough to see whether the child would move, in the silence Marlene held for one beat too long before turning back to the dinner schedule. Houses like this had their own weather, and tonight the air carried expectation. Annie remained where she was, small and still beside the utility table. Her crayon drawing abandoned in front of her. Her eyes stayed fixed on the direction the tray had gone. Rosa knelt in front of her daughter. "You are staying here," Annie frowned. "But what if?" "No." Rosa kept her voice quiet, but firm enough to settle the question before it could grow. "No upstairs. No sneaking. No checking on him. Not tonight." Annie lowered her head, but not out of obedience. Alone. It was worry. Rosa could already tell the difference. Worry made the child quieter, deeper somehow, as if her small body were trying to carry more feeling than it had room for. "What if he spills it again?" Annie asked. Rosa touched the side of her daughter's face. "Then somebody in that house will deal with it." But the answer sounded thin, even to her own ears. She stood and returned to the silver tray station where dessert plates were being stacked for later. Behind her, the whispers began in the low, drifting way they always did when people believed the important person had left the room. "He asked about her again, I heard. That's not normal. He's sick. Sick people get attached." A second voice dropped lower or desperate. Someone gave a short, humorless laugh. "Imagine being worth all that money and waiting on a little black girl to help you finish supper." "Hush. No, you hush, Mrs. Caldwell already thinks this whole thing looks inappropriate." Rosa kept folding linen napkins with steady hands, but her back had gone rigid. The cruelty in the words was familiar, not because it was loud, but because it was soft. It did not come dressed as rage. It came dressed as caution, as propriety, as the concern of people protecting order. That was how class spoke when it wanted to wound. Without taking responsibility for the wound, Marlene entered the pantry alcove with her clipboard tucked under one arm. The women fell silent at once. "If you all have enough breath for gossip," Marlene said, not raising her voice. "You have enough breath to finish service on time." No one answered. Silver clicked softly against linen. A cabinet door shut. The room resumed its practice efficiency. Rosa did not look up, but she felt a small pulse of gratitude anyway. Half an hour later, the first message came downstairs. One of the younger footmen, a college-age boy hired mostly for evenings and events, entered the kitchen with empty hands and uncertainty all over his face. "Marlene," he said, "Mr. Caldwell sent the tray back." The kitchen stilled again. "Returned." Marlene asked. He said he isn't hungry. Rosa's fingers stopped over the napkin she was folding. Marlene's expression did not change. Did he touch anything? The footman hesitated. I don't think so. Annie from the utility table looked up so quickly that her chair scraped the floor. Rosa turned at once. Sit down, she said quietly. Annie sat, but only because Rosa was looking directly at her. The concern in the child's face had grown sharper now. No longer simple curiosity, but something that ached to act. One of the women near the warming counter muttered, just low enough to sound like she hadn't meant to. Of course, he sent it back. He was waiting for her. Nobody replied, yet the sentence hung over the room with the stubbornness of smoke. Marlene dismissed the footman with a glance. Then she turned to the stove where the cook was plating a late tray for Monica, who had called to say she would be home within the hour. Warm him some soup, smaller bowl, less to carry. The cook looked surprised. He already refused. Then he can refuse it twice. Rosa bent back over the napkins. But she could feel Annie watching her. The child said nothing for nearly a full minute. Then softly enough that only Rosa could hear, she asked, "Did he not eat because I didn't go?" Rosa closed her eyes for a brief second. "No," she said, "that's not your fault, but maybe." "No." The word came out harder than Rosa intended. Annie flinched slightly and regret followed at once. Rosa softened her voice. "Baby, listen to me. Mr. Caldwell's dinner is not your job. He has a wife. He has staff. He has doctors. You hear me?" Annie nodded, but her eyes were unconvinced. Rosa knew that look. Children accepted rules long before they agreed with them. Upstairs, Ethan Caldwell sat in the quiet glow of his bedroom lamp and stared at the untouched tray on the overbed table. The bowl of chicken noodle soup gave off a faint curl of steam. Beside it sat soft dinner rolls, carefully buttered in a small dish of peaches. Someone had switched to lighter food, easier food, hopeful food. He knew the strategy. Reduce the portion. Reduce the humiliation. Make it seem manageable. Make it seem as though appetite were the problem. His right hand rested on the blanket, tremoring in stubborn rhythm. He had tried once already. The spoon had made it out of the bowl and halfway toward his mouth before the shaking worsened and broth splashed onto the table. A neat little reminder, enough to sour any remaining appetite. Enough to bring back the memory of Annie's voice saying, "It's okay," as though such things truly could be. He had not realized, not until this evening, how quickly absence could acquire shape. The room felt larger without her than it had before he ever met her. That was the danger of mercy, he supposed. Once it touched you, everything colder became harder to bear. He heard a soft knock. "Come in," he said. Marlene entered with the replacement tray. Her face was composed, but her eyes took in the first untouched tray at once. The kitchen thought perhaps something lighter might do better. "Sir, it won't." She set the new tray down anyway. "Would you like me to leave it?" Ethan almost told her to take both away. Instead, he looked at the second bowl, the smaller one. The careful effort it represented and asked the question before he had time to decide whether he should. "Is Rosa here tonight?" Marlene's hands paused briefly over the napkin she was straightening. "Yes, sir." "And her daughter?" Marlene looked at him then directly but without insolence. "Also." "Yes," he said. Nothing. The silence lengthened enough for truth to choose whether it would enter the room. When it did, it arrived quietly. "The child has been asking whether you were able to hold the spoon tonight." Marlene said something and Ethan's throat tightened. Marlene lowered her eyes again. "She appears concerned." Concerned. Such a restrained word for the warm and inconvenient miracle of being remembered by someone who owed him nothing. "You can go," he said. "Yes, sir." She left both trays behind downstairs. Monica Caldwell arrived just after 7, bringing a gust of cold night air, perfume, and the restless energy of someone annoyed to find home still waiting for her. She entered through the side passage from the garage in high boots and a cashmere wrap, speaking into her phone with clipped impatience until she reached the butler's pantry and saw Rosa standing near the coffee service. Her gaze moved past Rosa to Annie sitting at the utility table in the corner. The child had fallen quiet again, chin propped in one hand, crayons untouched. For a second, Monica said nothing. Then she ended her call and slipped the phone into her purse. "She's here again," Monica said. Rosa straightened. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. My sitter canceled." Monica looked toward Annie with the same cool appraisal she might have given an object left in the wrong room. "She seems to be developing a very personal interest in my husband." Rosa felt heat rise under her skin. "She's only worried, ma'am. Children worry about dolls and scraped knees. They do not insert themselves into private family matters unless someone has allowed it." Rosa understood the accusation for what it was. It was not really about Annie's kindness. It was about movement, about a child crossing an invisible line and being noticed on the other side. I have not encouraged anything improper, Rosa said carefully. Monica's eyes settled on her. See that you don't. Annie had turned by then, listening in the blunt, open way children always did. Monica glanced toward her, then back to Rosa and keep her out of sight. The words were spoken lightly, almost gracefully, but they carried enough dismissal to leave a bruise. Monica moved on without waiting for an answer. Rosa stood where she was for a moment longer, hands still at her sides, feeling the old shame press in from every direction. Not because she believed Monica, but because power had a way of making insult feel official. Across the room, Annie slid quietly off her chair and came to stand beside her mother. Did I do something bad? She whispered. Rosa looked down at her daughter's face. So open, so wounded by the possibility. No, she said at once. No, baby. Then why does she talk like that? Rosa's mouth tightened. She glanced toward the stairs, toward the bedroom above, toward the man who had returned 2 trays untouched because the one pair of small hands that had steadied his evening had not appeared. Because some people, Rosa said slowly, think kindness is only acceptable when it comes from the right kind of person. Annie frowned. What's the right kind? Rosa rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder and looked toward the kitchen where the second tray had been sent up, only to disappear into the silence above. She thought of Monica's tone, of the whispers in the pantry, of Ethan asking after Annie without ever saying the child's name aloud in front of the wrong people. Then she answered with the plainest truth she had, the kind that doesn't make them uncomfortable. Annie considered that for a moment, then looked toward the ceiling as if she could somehow see through it to the room above. That's silly, she said, and Rosa, tired as she was, scared as she was, could not disagree. By the next morning, the Caldwell estate had settled into kind of polished quiet that often followed a night of tension. Outside, a silver frost clung to the stone balustrades and the clipped hedges lining the back terrace. The fountain in the circular drive still ran, though the air had turned sharp enough to sting the lungs. Inside, breakfast service moved with its usual precision. Coffee was poured, toast was buttered, newspapers were folded and delivered to tables where people skimmed headlines they would forget by noon. The house performed normally beautifully. It always had, but Rosa Bennett had worked long enough in homes like this to know when normally was only costume. She arrived just before 8 with Annie bundled in a navy coat and knitted hat, her cheeks pink from the cold. The sitter had canlit again, and Rosa no longer bothered apologizing for circumstances no one else had offered to solve. She simply signed in at the service entrance, accepted Marlene's clipped nod, and led Annie back to the laundry room with the weariness of someone stepping once more into a room where yesterday's trouble had not actually left. Today, Rosa said, helping Annie out of her coat. You stay here unless I come for you. Annie looked up at her with unnerving seriousness for a 6-year-old. What if he doesn't eat breakfast either? Rosa set the coat over the chair and turned. Baby, I'm just asking. I know you are. Rosa crouched so they were eye level. And the answer is still no. Mr. Caldwell is not your responsibility. Annie pressed her lips together. Nobody acts like he's theirs. There it was again. That painful little clarity children stumbled upon when adults spent too much time lying politely. Rosa reached out and tucked a braid behind Annie's ear. You leave grown folks to their own choices, she said. That's all we can do. Annie did not look convinced, but she nodded. For the next hour, the house moved through its routines. Rosa stripped guest room sheets, polished bathroom mirrors no one had breathed on overnight, and dusted picture frames along the upstairs west corridor. The work steadied her hands, if not her thoughts. Somewhere beyond the walls of the master suite, a man who had once controlled boardrooms and skylines was likely trying to measure his morning by pills and tremors. Somewhere else in the house, Monica Caldwell was likely calculating appearances. Rosa had seen her briefly at breakfast from the far end of the hall. Monica had been dressed for the city, immaculate in cream and charcoal, speaking into her phone while standing near the grand staircase. She had not looked toward the service staff once, but she did not need to. Power in women like Monica rarely announced itself. It expected the room to rearrange around it. At 9, Rosa was folding fresh towels in the upstairs linen closet when she heard low voices from the open hall outside. I'm telling you, he asked if the child was here again twice. That can't end well. Rosa froze without meaning to. A second voice answered, older oscosis. Nothing in this house ends well anymore. There was a brief hush. Then the first speaker lowered her tone. Mrs. Caldwell knows. Of course she knows. She knows everything that threatens her place. Rosa set the towels down more firmly than necessary. The women outside moved on before she could identify them, their footsteps retreating toward the rear stairs. She did not follow. She did not need names. The meaning had already been delivered. Threatens her place. The phrase stayed with Rosa long after the voices disappeared. By 10 o'clock, Marlene sent her to clean the upstairs morning room, a sunlit space overlooking the back lawn where no one really sat anymore. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old magazines. Rosa worked quickly, shaking out throw pillows and wiping the glass top table near the window, but her attention kept drifting to the open doorway across the hall. From where she stood, she could see part of the corridor leading toward Ethan's suite. Twice staff entered carrying something. Once with tea, once with a small tray of toast and fruit. Both times they came out again with most of it untouched. On the second trip, the server was a young man named Colin, decent enough with the uncertain manners of someone who had not yet learned how to become hard in a wealthy household. As he passed the morning room, Rosa caught the look on his face and stepped into the hall. "He didn't take it?" she asked quietly. Colin shifted the tray in his hands. Half the toast remained. The orange juice glass was barely lowered. "He had some coffee," Colin said. "That's all." Rosa looked at the tray and then down the hall. "Did he say anything?" Colin hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one else was near. "Just asked what time Mrs. Caldwell would be back, and I told him she left for the city at 8:30. Rosa nodded once. That sounded like Ethan somehow. Not asking if Monica would come back. Asking when. As if precision could lessen disappointment, Colin moved on. Rosa returned to the morning room, but the dust cloth in her hand no longer had any weight. She thought of Annie downstairs with crayons and crackers and all that useless obedience a child could offer in a house where kindness had become suspicious. She thought of Ethan asking after the time like a man still trying against all evidence to understand the shape of neglect. At 11, a black SUV pulled into the circular drive. Rosa saw it from the window while polishing the brass lamp near the Shaw's lounge. It stopped too briefly to belong to a delivery and too smoothly to be service. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, early 40s, with the kind of ease that came from being expected. He wore a camel overcoat and carried no briefcase, only his phone and a casual confidence that made Rosa's stomach tighten on instinct. A moment later, Monica appeared in the front hall below. She had supposedly left for the city already. Yet there she was, descending the staircase with quick, eager steps she never used. When coming toward Ethan's room, even from the upper floor, Rosa could see the change in her. Not softness exactly, but animation. The mask of obligation she wore around her husband was gone. In its place stood a woman lit by anticipation. The man smiled when Monica reached him. Rosa stepped back from the window at once, not because she had been seen, but because some things were ugly enough without needing a better view. She moved to the door just as their voices floated upward from the entrance hall below. "You said the staff would be in the back," the man murmured. "They are," Monica replied. There was a low laugh. A touch too intimate for old friends, too easy for anything innocent. Rosa should have walked away then. Instead, she stood still, hidden by the angle of the upper hall, listening against her better judgment. "He's upstairs?" the man asked. Monica's answer came after the smallest pause. "Where else would he be?" The man said something too low to catch. Monica answered with a sigh that carried more irritation than concern. "He barely notices anything anymore." Rosa's fingers tightened around the dust cloth. Downstairs, the front door closed. Footsteps moved, not toward Ethan's suite, but toward the library at the rear of the main floor. A minute later, silence returned. Rosa went cold. She had seen enough in her life to recognize what should not have needed explaining. A husband ill upstairs, a wife returning under false pretenses, a man arriving when he should not, the library door closing between them. By the time Marlene found her 10 minutes later, Rosa had already finished the room without remembering a single movement of her hands. "Marlene says, switch to the formal sitting room," came the instruction from one of the pantry maids. Rosa nodded and moved on. She did not ask questions. Women in her position survived by knowing when silence protected more than speech, but all through the next hour, one thought pressed harder and harder against her ribs. Somewhere upstairs, Ethan Caldwell was asking what time his wife would be back. And downstairs, Monica was already home, just not for him. At noon, Rosa went to fetch Annie for lunch in the service kitchen. She found her seated at the utility table, drawing carefully with the pink crayon worn almost flat. "What are you making now?" Rosa asked. Annie held up the paper. It was a picture of a window, a bed, and a bowl with a spoon inside it. Beside the bed, she had drawn a little sun with a face. "It's for Mr. Caldwell, she said. Rosa sat down more slowly than usual. Why, so he remembers mornings can be nice. The innocence of it almost broke something in her. Before Rosa could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Monica passed the open doorway a moment later, her lipstick brighter than it had been at breakfast, her hair freshly smoothed as if the morning had improved her instead of burdened her. She did not glance into the service room, but behind her, faint on the air, lingered the warm, expensive cologne of a man who had no business being in her house. Annie looked up. Mrs. Caldwell came back. Yes, Rosa said. She looks happier. Rosa folded the drawing in half before Annie could see her face. Eat your sandwich, baby. Upstairs, Ethan Caldwell had heard the front door earlier. He had waited for footsteps in the hall, for the pause outside his room, for the sound of a hand on the knob. None had come. Now he sat beside the bedroom window, one untouched cup of coffee gone cold on the side table, watching the winter bare branches sway against the pale noon sky. On the desk near him lay a small folded napkin Annie had once handed back to him with solemn care. He had no reason to keep looking at it. Yet he did, and below him, in rooms built for comfort and appearances, betrayal moved softly enough to pass for ordinary life. That afternoon the house seemed to split itself into two separate worlds. On the main floor, doors opened and closed with cultivated discretion. Voices stayed low. The library remained shut longer than any ordinary visit required. Upstairs, in the stillness of his suite, Ethan Caldwell measured time not by clocks, but by sounds. He did not hear. No footsteps paused outside his room. No familiar knock came at the hour Monica once used to appear with a question about lunch or medication. The silence around him had become specific. It no longer felt accidental. It felt chosen. He sat near the window in the armchair by the reading lamp. Though reading had become difficult these days, his hands shook too much to hold a hardback steady for long, and his eyes, tired from bad sleep, and too much thinking, often gave up before the page did. The coffee on the side table had gone cold an hour earlier. Beside it lay the folded napkin Annie had once returned to him as if it were something worth preserving. He had told himself twice already to stop looking at it. He had failed both times. At 1:30, there came a soft knock on the open sitting room door that connected his bedroom to the hall. Ethan turned his head. Yes, the person who stepped in was not Monica. It was Annie. She entered cautiously, one small hand holding a folded sheet of paper, the other tucked behind her back as though she had rehearsed appearing this way. Her yellow sweater from the day before had been replaced by a soft navy cardigan, and her braids had loosened slightly at the ends. She stopped 3 steps inside the room and looked at him as if checking first whether she was welcome. Ethan stared at her in genuine surprise. How did you get up here? Annie considered the question. Walking despite himself, something shifted in his face. Does your mother know where you are? No. He exhaled through his nose. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. That is not reassuring. Annie came closer anyway. I only came for 1 minute. That's what people say right before they do something they're not supposed to do. She held out the folded paper. I made you this. Ethan took it with his left hand, the steadier one. When he unfolded it, he found a crayon drawing of a square bedroom with a large window, a bowl with a spoon beside it, and a bright round sun smiling from the corner of the page. On the bed sat a stick figure with dark hair, and one shaky hand. Standing beside the bed was a much smaller figure with braids and pink shoes. He looked at it longer than the drawing deserved by any technical standard. Then longer still. It's your room, Annie said. But I made the morning nicer. His throat tightened unexpectedly. I see that. You didn't have enough yellow in there. Ethan ran his thumb carefully along the edge of the paper. Apparently not. Annie took that as permission to climb onto the ottoman near his chair. She sat cross-legged, watching him with the serious patience she always seemed to bring into rooms where most adults only carried discomfort. Did you eat lunch? She asked. There it was again. No preamble, no social performance. Straight to the question that mattered to her. A little, he said. That means no. He glanced at her. Does your mother know you interrogate people? I'm not interrogating. I'm checking. He looked back at the drawing and then out the window where pale winter light lay flat over the lawn. You seem to think that's your job, Annie shrugged. Nobody else does it, right? The bluntness of that might have offended him if it had not also been so close to the truth. He folded the drawing once more, but gently this time, and set it beside the napkin on the table. Annie followed the movement with her eyes. You kept that, she said. Ethan knew immediately what she meant. Apparently. Why? He rested his trembling hand on the arm of the chair. The question should have been easy to avoid. He was a grown man, a private man, a man who had built whole careers on giving away only what served him. Yet, in front of this child, lies always seemed too large and too unnecessary. Because, he said slowly, some things matter more when no one else notices them. Annie nodded as if that made complete sense, perhaps to children. It did. For a while, they sat in companionable quiet. Annie looked around the room, taking in what she had not noticed before: the framed photographs on the bookshelf, the dark green throw folded over the sofa, the silver clock on the mantel, a model sailboat in a glass case near the desk. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. "A boat. I know that." She gave him a look that was too old for six. "Why do you have it?" Ethan followed her gaze. "My father had one like it when I was younger." "Did you go on a real boat, too?" He hesitated. "Yes." Was it fun? The question should not have hurt, but it did. Not because of the memory itself. Because of how far away it felt. He remembered being 19, standing on the deck of a rented sailboat in Nantucket Harbor with his father shouting instructions over the wind. He remembered strong hands, salt air, the sheer simplicity of a body that obeyed. That young man felt less like his past self now than like a relative he had once admired and lost contact with. "Yes," he said quietly. It was. Annie noticed the change in his voice at once. "Do you miss when things were easier?" Ethan looked at her. Children asked impossible questions with the soft confidence of people who had never been taught how much effort adults put into avoiding the obvious. "Yes," he said after a pause. "I do." She leaned her elbows on her knees. "My mama says everybody misses something." "Your mother sounds wise." "She says that's just another word for tired." That did it. A real smile, brief but unmistakable, touched his mouth before he could stop it. Annie's eyes lit up. "You did it again." "What?" "The face thing." He shook his head, though it only made the tremor in his hand more visible. "That has to be the least flattering description of a smile anyone has ever given me." It was still nice. The room changed a little more after that. Not dramatically. No miracle occurred. His hands still shook. His body still felt unreliable and heavier than it should. But some of the air went out of the dread that had been hanging there all morning. Then Annie noticed the tray near the side table by the sofa. A bowl of soup untouched. Half a sandwich untouched. A spoon lying exactly where it had been placed. She slid off the ottoman and walked toward it. "Annie," Ethan said more out of anticipation than protest. She peered down at the tray and then turned back to him. "You didn't eat lunch." "I said a little." "You said a pretend little." Before he could answer, she picked up the spoon and looked around for a napkin. Finding one folded beneath the plate, she brought both back with the solemn purpose of a child who had already decided what needed doing. "You don't have to," Ethan began. She stopped in front of him and repeated the line she had given him once before, almost word for word. "I know." His pride rose, as it always did, and met the hard truth of his own fatigue. He had not touched the tray because eating alone had begun to feel like failure stage 3 times a day. Each meal had become a test he was already tired of. Failing. Annie somehow stripped the performance out of it. With her, eating was not a measure of manhood. It was just lunch. "Only a few bites," he said at last. Annie nodded. "That's how lunch works." She held the spoon carefully while he leaned forward. The first swallow was awkward but manageable. The second went better. On the third, his hand jerked reflexively against the arm of the chair, and a bit of soup slipped onto the front of his sweater. He went still at once. Shame flashed through him so quickly it was almost physical, but Annie only lifted the napkin and blotted the spot with calm little dabs. "It's okay," she said. "This sweater is dark." The matter-of-fact mercy of it nearly undid him. He opened his mouth for another spoonful. By the time footsteps sounded in the hallway, Annie had coaxed 6 bites into him and wiped his sweater twice without ever once looking disgusted. Ethan heard the steps first, quick and purposeful, and knew before the figure appeared in the doorway who it would be. Rosa stopped short at the sight before her. Annie stood beside Ethan's chair with the spoon in one hand and the napkin in the other. The lunch tray sat between them, no longer untouched. Ethan looked up at Rosa with a complicated expression that held gratitude, embarrassment, and a strange, fragile calm. For one suspended moment, none of them spoke. Then Rosa closed her eyes briefly, as if asking heaven for patience before opening them again. "Annie," she said softly, "I knew I was going to find you here." Rosa stepped into the room and took in the whole picture at once. Annie standing beside Ethan Caldwell's chair with the spoon in her hand. The napkin folded over her wrist like a tiny waitress's cloth. And Mr. Caldwell himself, looking less humiliated than he had the night before, though no less fragile. Annie turned at her mother's voice and immediately lowered the spoon. "Mama." He ate 6 bites. Rosa let out a breath that might have become a laugh if worry had not gotten there first. I'm sure he did. Annie pointed to the tray as if evidence were necessary. And some of the sandwich. Rosa looked at Ethan. Then he was still seated near the window, one hand resting against the arm of the chair, the tremor moving steadily through his fingers, but there was color in his face now that had not been there earlier. A little dignity had come back with the food. A little life. It made what she had to do harder. I told you to stay in the laundry room, Rosa said, though there was no real anger left in it. Annie lowered her eyes. I know, and yet here you are. He still wasn't eating. Rosa pinched the bridge of her nose for one brief second. When she looked up again, Ethan was watching her, not with irritation, but with an understanding so quiet it made her uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Rosa said, and now she was speaking to him. Again, you apologize too much, Ethan replied. That may be true, sir, but it doesn't mean I'm wrong. Something almost like amusement passed over his face. Your daughter is stubborn. Rosa folded her arms. That unfortunately is true. Annie looked between them, uncertain whether this exchange was good or bad. I was helping, Ethan answered before Rosa could. Yes, you were. Rosa felt the room shift once more. The same way it had the night before when Ethan had chosen to defend Annie instead of retreating into embarrassment. It was not just gratitude. It was alignment. Dangerous alignment perhaps in a house where lines mattered more than kindness ever seemed to. She moved closer and took the spoon gently from Annie's hand. You have helped enough for one afternoon. Annie's face fell, but he still has some left. I see that, I can do the rest. No. The word came out more sharply than Rosa intended, and Annie flinched before. Stepping back from the chair, Ethan looked down at the tray. The room grew still. It was Annie who broke the silence, her voice smaller now. I just didn't want him to be alone. Rosa looked at her daughter and for one painful second, saw exactly how innocence made itself vulnerable in this world. Annie had no strategy, no motive, no sense of social distance. She simply saw hunger and loneliness and walked toward them. What frightened Rosa was not that the child had done anything wrong. It was that so few adults in this house could say the same. I know, baby, Rosa said quietly. Come on. Annie hesitated, then looked at Ethan. Do you want me to go? The question was so direct it made Rosa wsece. Ethan held Annie's gaze longer than he should have if he wanted to make this easier. Finally, he said in that low, worn voice that somehow always sounded more honest than polished. I want you to listen to your mother. It was the right answer. Rosa knew that. Annie did too, but disappointment still shadowed her face. She nodded and moved toward the door with slow, reluctant steps. Rosa followed, pausing only once at the threshold. Thank you for speaking kindly to her, she said without turning fully back. Behind her, Ethan answered just as quietly. Thank you for raising someone who knows how. Rosa did not trust herself to respond. She led Annie down the rear corridor and toward the service stairs, one hand resting between her daughter's shoulders. The child was silent until they reached the lower landing. Then, in a whisper shaped by confusion more than defiance, she asked, why do I have to leave if he wants me there? Rosa stopped walking. Because wanting and allowing were not the same thing in houses like this. Because being needed did not protect people like them. Because she had spent too many years learning that affection from the wealthy could change a life or ruin one sometimes in the same week. But Annie was 6, and 6-year-olds deserve truths they could bear. Because Rosa said carefully, sometimes grown-up lives are messy in ways children can't fix. Annie thought about that, but I made lunch less messy. Despite everything, Rosa smiled. Yes, you did. She set Annie up again in the laundry room with a fresh sheet of paper and strict instructions not to move. Then she returned upstairs with a fresh napkin, a glass of water, and the quiet resignation of a woman who knew she had already crossed the line between employee and witness. When Rosa re-entered the suite, Ethan had not moved much. The tray still rested on the table by his chair. He had managed another bite or two on his own, judging by the smaller edge missing from the sandwich, but the spoon had been set down crookedly in the bowl again. She crossed the room without comment and set the water beside him. You didn't have to come back, he said. Yes, I did. He glanced at her. Because I'm your employer. Rosa unfolded the napkin and placed it within his reach. Because somebody should. The sentence lingered between them. Ethan looked out the window at the winter bare trees swaying gently beyond the lawn. That's not the same thing. No, Rosa said. It isn't. She kept her hands busy, straightening the tray, clearing the damp spoon, wiping a faint spill from the table. Practical work. Work that did not ask emotional questions, yet the room itself had begun to ask them anyway. Did Monica say anything to you after last night? Ethan asked suddenly. Rosa's hand paused over the tray. Nothing. I can't survive. That's not what I asked. She looked at him then. Really looked. Illness had changed him, but not so much that she had forgotten this was still a man who knew how to notice what others left unsaid. She told me to keep Annie out of sight. Rosa answered. A bitter expression touched his mouth. Of course she did. Rosa lowered her voice. Mrs. Caldwell doesn't like anything she can't control. He did not answer, but something in his face darkened with recognition. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint clink of glass as Rosa adjusted the water tumbler. Then Ethan asked, was she home today? The question was simple, too simple. Rosa felt an old instinct flare in her chest. That servant's instinct to know where discretion ended and danger began. She could still step back from this. She could say she didn't know. She could protect her job by protecting his ignorance. But there were some silences that turned into complicity if you held them too long. She came back before noon. Rosa said slowly. Ethan's eyes shifted toward her. Before noon. Yes, sir. His hand on the armrest trembled harder now, though. Whether from disease or something else, she could not tell. I thought she went into the city. That's what everyone thought. He looked at her fully then, and Rosa realized with a start that he already understood there was more. He was not a fool waiting for gossip. He was a husband who had spent months listening to absence and finally hearing its pattern. Was she alone? He asked. Rosa should have lied. The thought came and went in less than a second. Instead, she said, no, sir. The room seemed to empty itself of air. Ethan's expression did not break. That was what startled her most. He did not gasp, did not curse, did not lunge for the nearest object in wounded masculine outrage. He simply sat there utterly still except for the tremor and absorbed the blow as if he had already been bracing for it. Did you see him? He asked after a long pause. Yes. Do I know him? I couldn't say, sir, but perhaps he did. Wealth moved in circles. So did betrayal. Ethan turned back toward the window. His voice, when it came again, sounded flatter, colder. Not with anger exactly, but with the exhaustion of a man watching suspicion settle into certainty. And she went to the library, he said. It was not a question. Rosa hesitated. Yes. He closed his eyes. There were some humiliations deeper than the body. Deeper even than the daily indignities of tremor and spilled meals and staff who learned to pity from a safe distance. There was this knowing your wife still had energy for anticipation. Still had softness for someone. Still knew how to come alive in a doorway and realizing none of it belonged to you anymore. Rosa should have left then. She knew that, but something held her in place. Perhaps the same thing that had made Annie cross the threshold in the first place. I'm sorry, she said. Ethan let out a slow breath that almost sounded like a laugh. If laughter had been hollowed out and left to dry. You apologized too much, too. Rosa did not smile. Maybe some things deserve it. He opened his eyes again and looked down at the tray. No, he said quietly. Some things deserve the truth. Evening came early in late autumn. By the time Rosa finished her shift, the sky beyond the Caldwell estate had already faded to slate. Annie was sleepy on her feet. All earlier determination worn down by crayons, worry, and waiting. Rosa took her coat from the hook by the service entrance and buttoned it up while the child leaned into her. Did he eat the rest? Annie murmured. Rosa thought of Ethan by the window, the untouched pain on his face when she told him Monica had not been alone. She thought of the tray between them, of the spoon, of the truths that arrived without warning and sat down like unwelcome guests. A little more, she said. Annie nodded against her coat, satisfied enough by that. But upstairs, after the house had quieted and Monica had still not come to his room, Ethan Caldwell sat alone with his phone in his left hand and stared at the screen longer than he should have needed to. Monica had left it carelessly on the side table in the library once before, and he had never looked. Pride had stopped him. Decency had stopped him. Denial had done the rest. Tonight, none of those things felt as strong. At last, he opened his messages and searched for her name in the shared family account she had once asked him to sync for convenience. What he found was not a confession. Not immediately, just fragments, a missed call, a calendar notation, a contact saved without a surname. Then one message sent that morning while he was upstairs asking what time she would be home. Can't stay long. He's having a bad hand day. Below it the reply. Then don't come down when the house settles. Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. His hands shook so hard the screen trembled with it, not because he had imagined wrong, because he had imagined less. Outside the window, the grounds lay cold and dark under the first hard stars of evening. Inside, A folded child's drawing still sat beside a plain linen napkin on the table near his chair, bright with crayon sunlight no real sky had managed to give him that day. And for the first time since illness entered his house, Ethan understood that betrayal rarely arrived like thunder. Most times it came home polished, well-dressed, and perfectly on time for everyone except the person it was leaving behind. Ethan did not sleep. The message remained on his phone long after the screen should have gone dark. Its words burned into him with a steadiness his own body no longer possessed. Can't stay long. He's having a bad hand day. Then don't come down when the house settles. By midnight, the house had gone silent in all the ordinary ways. Doors had closed. The last dishwasher cycle had finished. Somewhere far below, an automatic light clicked off in the back hall. But in Ethan's room, silence was no longer empty. It was crowded. Crowded with memory, with humiliation, with the cold recognition that the pity Monica wore in public had long ago hardened into contempt in private. He set the phone down at last and stared at his reflection in the black window. A bad hand day. Not Ethan. Not my husband. Not even he's having a hard time. Just a bad hand day. As if the tremor were all he had become. As if the woman who once held his arm at charity galas and looked at him like he had built the world himself now saw him as little more than an inconvenience measured in symptoms. His right hand shook on the blanket. He laid his left hand over it out of instinct. Though both of them knew it would not help. The movement only reminded him of all the times Monica had watched that same hand fail him across a dinner tray. A button, a glass, a pen. He had mistaken her distance for grief, mistaken her impatience for exhaustion, mistaken above all her absence for helplessness. Outside, a branch scraped faintly against the glass. Ethan leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. For the first time since the diagnosis, he felt something more dangerous than despair returning to him. Not hope, not yet, something harder, something with edges, decision. It arrived without drama, no sudden surge of anger, no shattered glass, no shouted vow against betrayal. Ethan had never been a theatrical man. Even at the height of his power, his most consequential choices were often made in stillness, then carried out with such clean efficiency that the room barely noticed what had been decided until it was too late to undo it. This would be one of those decisions. At 6:30 the next morning, before the sun had fully lifted over the bare trees behind the estate, Ethan was already awake. He had not changed out of the dark sweater he slept in when he spent the night in the chair instead of the bed. The lamp near the window still glowed. On the side table, Annie's crayon drawing lay beside the folded napkin like two quiet witnesses to the previous day. He reached for the phone again. This time not to search, not to confirm, but to call. The number was one he had known for years. Harold Whitmore answered on the third ring, his voice thick with the hour, but alert by the time he said Ethan's name. "Ethan, is everything all right?" "No," Ethan said. There was a pause, not a dramatic one. Just long enough for an old lawyer to understand that a client was not calling at dawn to discuss small inconveniences. "What happened? I need to see you today." "Today," Harold repeated. Paper rustled faintly on his end. "Is this medical financial?" "Nagad." Another pause. This one more focused. "All right, I can be in Westchester by 10 o'clock. Make it earlier. I'll leave now." Ethan looked toward the bedroom door, still closed, beyond which the rest of the house slept under the illusion of another ordinary morning. "And Harold, yes, I don't want Monica knowing." When the call ended, Ethan placed the phone carefully on the side table and stared at his hand until the tremor blurred at the edges of his vision. Years ago, people liked to say that money bought options. In truth, money bought time, distance, and the privilege of making painful decisions in private. But even now, with all his resources, none of it softened the ugliness of what had to be done. It only allowed him to do it without asking permission. By 8 o'clock, breakfast had come and gone untouched, except for black coffee and half a piece of dry toast. Ethan had tried the toast only to prove to himself he could still complete a simple act without assistance. He could barely, if no one watched. The effort exhausted him anyway. Monica did not come to his room. That, more than anything, clarified his resolve. Guilt might have brought flowers, excuses, manufactured tenderness. Innocence might have brought confusion, but Monica brought nothing, not even caution. She still believed herself safely unobserved. At 9:15, Marlene knocked and entered with the day's medication tray. "You have a visitor arriving at 9:30, sir," she said. "Mr. Whitmore." Ethan glanced up. "Send him through the study door, not the main hall." Marlene's expression did not change, but he saw that she understood the instruction was deliberate. "Yes, sir." She set the tray down beside him and hesitated. "Would you like breakfast replaced?" "No." "As you wish." Before she left, Ethan said, "If Mrs. Caldwell asks, tell her I'm resting." Marlene inclined her head. "Yes, sir." The lawyer arrived at 9:28. Harold Whitmore had represented Ethan for nearly 12 years, long enough to remember him before the disease, before the hollowing out, before all the household silences acquired a second meaning. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, immaculate, even at short notice, with the restrained manner of a man who knew the real value of discretion. When Marlene brought him through the side entrance of the private sitting room, he took one look at Ethan and closed the door behind him without speaking. For a moment, the two men simply regarded one another. "You look terrible," Harold said at last. Ethan almost smiled. "That's friendship talking. That's eyesight." Harold set his leather folder on the side table and took the chair opposite him. His gaze moved once to the drawing and the folded napkin, but lingered on neither. That too was friendship, seeing without intruding. "What do you need?" he asked. Ethan reached for his phone with his steadier hand and unlocked the screen. The tremor in the other had worsened with fatigue, but he ignored it. He opened the messages, found the exchange, and handed the phone across. Harold read, silently. The change in his face was minimal but unmistakable. Not surprise. Confirmation. "When did you find this?" "Last night." "Is there more?" "Enough for me." Harold handed the phone back. "Enough for suspicion." "Yes. Maybe enough for a strategy. Not enough yet for war." Ethan set the phone down again. "I'm not interested in dramatics." "No," Harold said. "You never are. Which is why I'm going to tell you something you won't enjoy hearing. If you want to move on this cleanly, you need facts, not instincts." Ethan looked toward the window. Frost had melted from the terrace railing, leaving shining droplets in the weak morning light. "I know what I saw, and I believe you." Harold folded his hands, but belief and documentation are not the same thing, especially where money like yours is concerned. The room fell quiet. Ethan had spent too many years in boardrooms not to recognize the truth when it came dressed without comfort. He hated that Harold was right. Hated even more that Monica's betrayal would now need the same cold procedures as a hostile acquisition. Evidence, timing, containment. "What do you recommend?" he asked. Harold opened the folder he had brought and drew out a notepad. "First, we review your current estate structure. Every trust, every inheritance clause, every survivorship provision. Second, we separate what can be changed immediately from what requires formal notice. Third, if divorce becomes your next move, we make sure you are positioned before she realizes the ground is shifting." When Ethan said, "Not if," Harold looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. Saying it out loud changed something. The word settled into the room like a legal seal pressed into wax. Ethan rested his hand against the arm of the chair until the tremor eased slightly. "I want her removed from everything she can be removed from." "Everything." "Yes." Harold took that in without blinking. "And the rest?" The question had been waiting in Ethan before the lawyer ever arrived. It rose now, unexpected only in how certain it felt. "There's a child," he said. Harold's brows drew together. "A child. Rosa Bennett's daughter. The housekeeper." "Yes." Harold leaned back in his chair. "Ethan, she is the only person in this house who helped me because she wanted to, not because she was paid to, obligated to, or watched." Harold did not answer immediately. He had known Ethan long enough to hear the difference between impulse and conviction. When he finally spoke, his tone had grown more careful. "And what exactly are you thinking?" Ethan glanced toward the side table where Annie's drawing lay in a patch of pale light. The little crayon sun looked absurdly cheerful in a room built for adult ruin. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I need to decide what kind of people my life will continue rewarding." At 10 o'clock, Harold left through the same private door he had entered. Carrying a list of documents to retrieve in a silence he knew better than to break, the house remained outwardly unchanged. Somewhere downstairs, china clinked ked. A vacuum started and stopped in a distant hall. Monica was still in her rooms, unaware that while she had been perfecting the appearance of a wife, Ethan had quietly begun preparing to become a man she could no longer predict. And for the first time since Parkinson's had entered his body and rearranged the meaning of strength, Ethan Caldwell understood that the hand he could no longer steady might still sign the most important decision of his life. By late afternoon, a brittle kind of order had returned to the Caldwell estate. It was the sort of order that depended less on peace than on discipline. Doors opened quietly, conversation stopped when footsteps approached. The silver gleamed, the flowers in the front hall were refreshed, and the dinner service was laid out with its usual measured elegance. To anyone visiting for an hour, it would have looked like wealth doing what wealth did best, disguising fracture behind polish. But fracture had a sound of its own once you knew how to hear it. Rosa Bennett heard it in the clipped exchanges between Marlene and the evening staff. She heard it in Monica's footsteps crossing the upper hall twice in under 10 minutes. Quick and uneven, then slowing whenever she neared a doorway where someone might see her. Most of all, she heard it in the silence coming from Ethan Caldwell's suite. A silence different from the old kind. The old silence had felt defeated. This one felt watchful. Annie, seated at the utility table with her crayons spread in an uneven fan, looked up every time someone passed the open laundry room door. "Do you think he ate lunch today?" she asked for what felt like the fourth time. Rosa folded a stack of hand towels and kept her eyes on her work. "I think Mr. Caldwell had a busy day." "That's not what I asked." "No," Rosa admitted, "it isn't." Annie returned to her drawing, but only for a minute. "You think he's sad?" Rosa paused, one towel half folded in her hands. Sad was too small a word for what she suspected Ethan had become since the night before. But children lived inside manageable words, and there was mercy in keeping them there a little longer. "I think," she said slowly, "he's thinking hard." Annie frowned. "Is that bad?" Sometimes the child considered that, and then with the solemnity she brought to all moral matters, said thinking hard usually makes grown-ups mean. Rosa nearly smiled. Not always, but she understood the instinct behind it. Adults under pressure often reached for the nearest vulnerable thing and pressed downward. Annie had seen enough of that already to recognize the pattern. Upstairs, Ethan sat at the desk in his private sitting room with Harold Whitmore's notes spread in a neat stack before him. He had not been able to hold a pen long enough to sign anything meaningful that afternoon, but he had read every page: trust structures, beneficiary designations, inheritance contingencies, medical powers, shared accounts, the legal architecture of a marriage built in good faith and now decaying from the inside. Beside the papers lay a second folder Harold's assistant had sent over by courier just afternoon. That folder was thinner, more dangerous. Preliminary records, security timestamps, vehicle logs from the front gate. Discreetly obtained hotel charges linked to a private card. Monica had once assured Ethan she used only for charity travel. Nothing explosive yet, nothing theatrical, but enough to draw the outline of a betrayal that was no longer abstract. He turned one page with care, flattening it with his left hand, while the right tremored uselessly beside it. 3:11 p.m. Vehicle entry. No staff request logged. Guest not registered through main calendar. Another page. 11:07 a.m. Library door access. 11:54 a.m. Door access. Again, no meeting scheduled. The details should have felt clinical. They did not. Each line seemed to strip another layer from the lie he had been living inside. Monica had not merely drifted. She had arranged, timed, managed, and protected her betrayal with the same social precision she once brought to galas and donor dinners. Even now, he found himself less stunned by her disloyalty than by her efficiency. A soft knock sounded at the outer door. He closed the folder at once. Yes, Marlene entered with his evening medication tray and a fresh glass of water. Her posture was as exact as always, yet he noticed at once that her eyes moved briefly to the desk, to the closed folder, to his face. "Your dinner will be up in 20 minutes, sir," she said. "Thank you." She set the water down. "Mrs. Caldwell asked whether you'll be joining her downstairs." Ethan gave the question no more reaction than it deserved. "No." "Very good, sir." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Dr. Hayes confirmed. Friday morning, 9:30. Ethan nodded once. "Fine." Marlene hesitated. It was slight, but he had begun to notice the pauses people made around truth. "There's one other thing, sir." He looked up. "Mrs. Caldwell has a guest expected this evening." The room cooled by a degree. "A guest?" Ethan repeated. "Yes, sir. She requested coffee service in the blue sitting room after dinner." The blue sitting room, not the library this time. Interesting. He studied Marlene's face, but she had long ago mastered the art of carrying information without seeming to own it. "Did she say who?" "No, sir. Of course, she hadn't." Ethan rested his left hand on the edge of the desk to still the impulse to react too visibly. "Very well." Marlene inclined her head and withdrew. For several seconds after the door closed, Ethan did not move. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and looked toward the window where the late autumn light had turned hard and silver. So Monica was adjusting, becoming more careful, or perhaps only more comfortable. Betrayal, once it survived discovery without consequence, usually grew bolder. He thought of Harold's voice that morning. Facts, not instincts. Position before she realizes the ground is shifting. The ground, Ethan thought, had already begun to move. Downstairs, Monica Caldwell dressed for dinner as though her life remained perfectly under control. She chose a dark green silk blouse that sharpened the pale gold in her hair and a slim black skirt that made her look elegant without seeming overdone. She stood before the mirror in her dressing room, adding lipstick with steady hands, then stepped back to assess the effect. Not for Ethan. She had not dressed for Ethan in a very long time. The realization did not trouble her enough to examine it. What troubled her, though only faintly, was something else. The atmosphere in the house had changed. Ethan had not confronted her. He had not accused. He had not even asked the questions a weaker man might have blurted in panic. Instead, he had gone quiet in a way that felt less defeated than before. It irritated her. Silence when chosen rather than suffered created uncertainty. She reached for her phone on the vanity and typed one quick message. Come after 8. Use the side drive. The reply came almost immediately. You sure? She looked at herself in the mirror and smiled without warmth. Yes. Then she slipped the phone into her purse and went downstairs. Rosa saw her only briefly as Monica crossed the front hall on the way to dinner, but brief was enough. Wealth carried mood the way perfume carried notes. Tonight, Monica moved with the calm assurance of a woman who believed she had regained the upper hand. Rosa felt the chill of it even from the service corridor. Mama, Annie whispered from her chair. As Mrs. Caldwell smiling, Rosa glanced toward the hall a little. She only smiles like that when she's about to be fake. Rosa turned to look at her daughter fully. Where did you learn that? Annie shrugged. From people. There was no good answer to that, so Rosa picked up the folded table linens and carried them to the pantry instead. Dinner passed with unusual quiet. Ethan remained upstairs. Monica ate alone in the formal dining room, barely touching the sea base prepared for her and sending half the plate back untouched. At 8 to 10, the side drive chime sounded softly through the service hall, barely audible unless one was listening for it. Rosa, carrying a tray of folded napkins toward the back pantry, froze for half a second. Marlene, who was reviewing the coffee service setup, did not look surprised. Take that to the blue sitting room, she told a server. Yes, ma'am. Rosa lowered her eyes and kept walking, though her pulse had quickened. The blue sitting room was on the main floor off the east hall, quieter than the library. Farther from the formal rooms, chosen, no doubt, because it felt less exposed. Annie looked up as Rosa reappeared in the laundry doorway. What happened? Nothing. That wasn't a nothing face. Rosa exhaled color quietly, but Annie had already heard the side drive chime, too. Children noticed repeated sounds the way adults noticed repeated lies. At 8:15, Ethan rang for Marlene. When she arrived, he had already closed the folders on his desk and moved to the armchair by the window, a blanket across his knees, his expression unreadable. Yes, sir. Has Mrs. Caldwell finished dinner? Yes. And her guest arrived. Marlene did not answer immediately. There is coffee service in the blue sitting room. That was answer enough. Ethan nodded once. Good. Something about the word made her glance up. Sir asked Colin to bring me the house tablet. The house tablet? Yes. Marlene hesitated right away. When the tablet arrived, Ethan waited until the door was closed before waking the internal security interface Harold had reminded him still existed under the household admin settings. He had installed the system years earlier, then mostly forgotten its details once staff and routine took over, but memory returned quickly when necessity sharpened it. Camera map. Ground floor, East Hall, blue sitting room exterior. He selected the hallway feed first. Monochrome, quiet, empty, but for the tray cart standing outside the closed sitting room doors. Then, with the deliberate steadiness of a man whose body no longer obeyed, but whose mind remained his own, Ethan accessed the archived audio permissions he had once approved for after-hours security monitoring. He did not yet press play. Instead, he sat looking at the paused screen, at the closed doors, at the cart outside them, and understood that this was the last moment before suspicion became proof. Once he crossed it, something in the life he had tried to preserve by patience, denial, and sheer endurance would end for good. On the side table beside him lay his folded drawing, bright with crayon sunlight that no real room in this house seemed able to hold for long. Ethan placed one trembling hand flat against the tablet screen and thought, not for the first time. That illness had taken much from him, but not the ability to recognize the precise second when a man must stop waiting to be spared and start deciding what he will no longer tolerate. Ethan pressed play. At first, there was only the low murmur of the blue sitting room's ventilation system and the faint clink of china. Then came Monica's voice softened into the intimate register she no longer used with him. You took your time, a man answered warm and amused. You said after 8, I said, use the side drive. There's a difference. The reply came with a quiet laugh. You're jumpier than usual because this house has ears. Ethan sat motionless in the chair, the blanket across his knees suddenly feeling heavier. The tablet screen showed only the closed double doors of the blue sitting room and the unattended coffee cart outside them. No faces, no gestures, only voices. In some ways, that made it worse. Deception stripped of performance was often more honest than anything seen in daylight. Inside the room, a cup touched its saucer. "He asked about me this morning," Monica said. "Did he?" "Yes. And I told him nothing." The man gave a soft knowing hum. "So he suspects." Ethan suspects everything when he's feeling sorry for himself. The sentence landed with cold precision. Ethan did not move. His right hand trembled harder against the armrest, but the rest of him went still in the way. A man grows still when impact has passed beyond pain and entered clarity. The man spoke again. "You said he barely notices anything anymore." "He notices what affects him," Monica replied. "And lately that means his hands, his pills, whether the soup is too hot, whether someone has moved the remote." She exhaled, and Ethan could hear the impatience in it. The practiced weariness she had displayed to others as sacrifice. Here in private, the sacrifice had curdled into disdain. "I'm tired, Daniel. I'm tired of the schedules, the specialists, the bad nights, the accidents, the constant need. Do you know what it's like to live in a house where every room smells faintly of medicine?" Danielle. The name settled into place without surprise. Ethan knew him. Not well, but enough. Daniel Reeves, real estate consultant, polished, connected, welcome in rooms where people spoke easily about restoration funds and waterfront development. Charming in the strategic way of men who learned early that being agreeable was often more profitable than being deep. Daniel's voice lowered. "Then stop living like that. It's not that simple." "It could be." Monica made a small sound somewhere between frustration and laughter. "That is exactly the kind of thing a man says when he has never had to untangle a marriage this public." "And what are you waiting for?" Daniel asked. "A miracle recovery." The room went quiet for one beat, maybe two. Then Monica said, "No, I'm waiting for the path of least damage." Ethan closed his eyes. Not grief, not confusion, not even guilt, calculation. He had expected betrayal to be ugly, but some part of him had still imagined it tangled in remorse, in desperation, in one human weakness colliding with another. This was cleaner than that, colder. Monica was not lost in emotion. She was managing an inconvenience until the paperwork of her preferred life could be resumed. Daniel lowered his voice further, but the system caught him clearly enough. "And if he doesn't decline fast enough," Monica answered without hesitation. "He will." The words emptied the room of air. Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the tablet screen, at the closed doors, at the untouched coffee service waiting outside, as if hospitality itself had become an accomplice. Daniel must have heard something in her tone because his next question came slower. "You really think it's getting that bad?" "I've seen the reports." Ethan thought of the file thrown at his chest. "Do you know your condition is getting worse?" "Every report says the same thing." The memory no longer stung. It clarified. "He can barely get through dinner without help." Monica continued. "Some days he can't sign his own name properly, and when he's in one of his moods, he just sits upstairs like a ghost in his own house." Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then with the false gentleness of a man careful around someone else's cruelty, he asked, "Do you feel bad at all?" Monica's laugh was low and incredulous. "About what?" "About him." Another clink of porcelain. Coffee being poured, perhaps. Or sat down untouched. "I felt bad a year ago," Monica said. "I felt bad when there was still some version of him left to reach. Now," she exhaled, "now I feel trapped." Ethan let the word settle inside him. Trapped. As if she were the prisoner. As if illness had happened to her more than to the man whose body had become unreliable under his own skin. Daniel's chair creaked faintly. "Then come away this weekend. Just one night." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because appearances still matter." There it was, the axis around which Monica's moral life had always turned. Once love stopped being useful enough to keep it fed. Appearances, not vows, not care, not truth, only the visible arrangement of things. Daniel sounded impatient now. "You keep saying that and you keep forgetting what his name still carries. Ethan Caldwell doesn't just get cheated on quietly. He gets talked about, written about, pied in all the right places by all the wrong people." Ethan almost smiled at that. She was right in her way, but she had mistaken his public significance for his private blindness, and that would prove expensive. "And the money?" Daniel asked, the question arriving with more confidence than decency. Monica was silent long enough that Ethan knew before she answered that the silence itself was admission. "I'm not walking away stupid," she said at last. A lesser man might have thrown the tablet across the room, might have summoned staff, demanded doors opened, confronted humiliation with noise. Ethan did none of those things. He sat with one hand shaking and his jaw locked, listening as the last thin curtain between suspicion and proof burned away without flame. Daniel lowered his voice again. Does he know about me? No. Are you sure? Yes. The certainty in her answer was almost enough to pity. Almost. Ethan stopped the recording. The blue sitting room vanished from the screen, leaving only his reflection in the black glass of the tablet. He placed it face down on the side table and sat very still, letting the quiet return in full. Somewhere in the house, a door shut. Distantly, a vacuum started on another floor and stopped again. Life continued its household motions with offensive normally. On the side table, Annie's folded drawing lay bright against the dark wood, the crayon sun smiling up from where the paper had slipped partly open. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. Strange that the most honest thing in the room should be a child's drawing of a better morning. A knock sounded at the outer door. He did not answer immediately. When the knock came again, he said, "Come in." Marlene entered with the caution of someone reading weather. "Sir, Mrs. Caldwell asks whether you'll be taking your medication now or later." Ethan looked up. The simplicity of the message almost stunned him. Monica sat downstairs with her lover, her betrayal still warm in the room around her, and sent medication inquiries as if marriage were a trade to be managed from afar. "Now," he said. Marlene stepped closer, set the water beside him, and opened the medication case with efficient fingers. She paused only once, when she saw the angle of his face more clearly in the lamplight. "Are you unwell, sir?" The question, unlike most in this house, sounded sincere. Ethan took the pills one by one with his left hand. The right shook against the blanket. He swallowed, then set the glass down more carefully than he felt. "No," he said, "not anymore." Marlene looked at him, perhaps sensing there was more in the answer than the words themselves contained. But discretion won as it usually did with her. "Very good, sir." She turned to go. "Marlena," she stopped at once. "Sir, in 10 minutes, ask Mrs. Caldwell to come upstairs." Her expression did not change, though something sharpened behind her eyes. "Alone?" "Yes. And if she asks why?" Ethan looked toward the window where the dark glass showed him only a faint outline of himself in the room behind him. "Tell her I finally have something important to discuss." Marlene inclined her head and left. 10 minutes later, Ethan had moved from the armchair to the straight-back chair beside his desk. The transfer had cost him more effort than he wanted to admit, but he preferred to meet Monica sitting upright rather than half-reclined like a patient waiting for terms. Harold's folder lay closed in one neat stack. The tablet sat beside it, screen dark. Annie's drawing remained within sight. When Monica entered without knocking, the perfume of the blue sitting room seemed to come in with her. She was composed, of course, curious, faintly annoyed, but composed. Marlene said, "You wanted to see me." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. Yes, he thought. This was the face he had once trusted in daylight. This was the voice that had once sounded like home. And now, after all the months of illness and humiliation and careful avoidance, after every untouched meal and every polished lie, he could finally see her whole. "Yes," he said quietly. "Sit down." Something in his tone made her pause. But Monica Caldwell sat. Monica sat with one leg crossed over the other, her hands resting lightly in her lap, every inch of her arranged composure suggesting that whatever this conversation might be, she had already decided how she would behave inside it. The lamplight softened the silk at her collar and caught the gold in her hair. If a stranger had walked in at that moment, he might have thought she was a devoted wife answering a late-night request from an ailing husband. Ethan looked at her and felt nothing of the old confusion now. No yearning, no reflex to preserve what had already been hollowed out. Just the cool, painful steadiness of a man finally standing in the truth of his own life. "You said you wanted to discuss something important," Monica said. "What is it?" Ethan rested his left hand on the arm of the chair and let the tremor in his right continue without apology. He no longer had any interest in disguising what she had already used against him. "I know about Daniel." The sentence landed cleanly between them for one fraction of a second. Monica's face changed, not dramatically. She was too disciplined for that. But the control slipped just enough for surprise to show before she pulled herself back into it. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Ethan almost admired the speed of the lie. "Almost." "Yes, you do." Monica held his gaze. "Daniel Reeves is an acquaintance." "No." His voice remained calm. "He is your lover." The words seemed to sharpen the room. Monica's mouth tightened, but she did not rise. "You are tired, Ethan. And when you're tired, you become suspicious. And when you're cornered, you become insulting." A faint flush crept up her neck. "I am not insulting you. You already did that downstairs." That stopped her for the first time since entering the room. Monica glanced toward the tablet on the desk. Then back to him. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Perhaps, but Ethan noticed everything now. What exactly are you accusing me of? She asked. I am not accusing you. He leaned back slightly, every word measured. I am informing you that I know. Silence spread out from the sentence and settled over the room like a weight. Monica was clever enough to understand that there were different kinds of danger. Wild accusations could be redirected. Suspicion could be gaslit, soothed, manipulated. Knowledge was another matter. She uncrossed her legs slowly. How much do you think you know? Ethan looked at her for a long moment, enough to understand that while I was upstairs asking what time my wife would be home, my wife was already in this house with another man. The color in Monica's face drained and returned in the same instant. You had someone watching me. I had truth watching you. It did most of the work on its own. She stood abruptly then, not in outrage, but in the restless motion of someone whose confidence had finally been punctured. This is absurd. If you've been monitoring me in my own house. Our house, Ethan said quietly. Though I'm beginning to understand how little that word has meant to you. Monica turned away and took 2 steps toward the window, arms folding tightly across herself. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Less polished now, more human, though not kinder. You don't understand what it's been like. Ethan almost laughed, but the sound died before it could fully form. No. Then explain it to me. She spun back toward him. Do you want me to be honest? At last. Fine. Her eyes flashed. It has been exhausting. It has been lonely. It has been years of appointments, medication charts, canceled plans, ruined meals, bad nights, worse mornings, and a man who became someone I could no longer reach. Ethan listened without interrupting. The cruelty in her was easier to bear now that it no longer wore the mask of concern. Monica took another step toward him, as if anger might turn confession into righteousness. You think this only happened to you, Ethan. You think your illness walked into this house and touched only your body. But it took everything. Every room in this place changed. Every day became organized around what you could not do. And somewhere in all of that, I disappeared. No, Ethan said. You revealed yourself. She stared at him. He continued, voice still low, still terribly composed. Illness did not make you disloyal. It made loyalty inconvenient. That is not the same thing. Monica's face hardened at once. Easy for you to say, is it? You don't know what it is to be trapped beside decline. The words hung there, ugly and glittering with their own self-importance. Ethan felt something in him go stiller than anger. And you don't know what it is to be the decline. Monica's breath caught. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. Truth, when it came from suffering instead of performance, rarely required volume. For a moment, the room held only the faint hum of the heating vent and the distant settling sounds of the house. Monica looked away first. I never wanted this life, she said, quieter now. Not this version of it. No, Ethan replied. You wanted the version that photographed well. She flinched as if slapped, not because he had shouted, but because the sentence had found the softest part of her vanity and pressed there without mercy. Monica straightened. So what now? You expose me, humiliate me, make yourself the tragic husband and me the villain. Ethan looked down at his trembling hand and then back up at her. You did not need my help becoming that. Her jaw tightened. You're enjoying this. The accusation was so far from the truth that he almost pied her for needing to believe it. No, he said, I am ending it. For the first time that evening, Monica said nothing. Ethan let the silence stand long enough for the meaning to enter fully. Then he continued, in the morning, Harold Whitmore will begin formal divorce proceedings. Monica went very still. You're serious. I have never been more serious. She took 1 step toward the desk. You can't do this in anger. I'm not doing it in anger. I'm doing it in clarity. And what exactly do you think a divorce like this will do? She demanded. To your name, to your investors, to the press. There it was again. Reputation before remorse. Optics before truth. Ethan gave her a look that might once have made competitors abandon entire negotiations. Illness had weakened his body. But not that. Not entirely. You are still thinking like a woman arranging table settings, he said. I am thinking like a man ending a fraud. Monica stared at him, her breathing uneven. Now, after everything, I stayed through. He held her gaze. Stayed through. Monica, you left long before tonight. You only kept your clothes here. The words broke something in her composure at last. You have no idea what I gave up. And you have no idea what I saw, Ethan replied. You looked at my illness and calculated inconvenience. You looked at my weakness and began waiting for your freedom. You looked at my life and started measuring what you could still extract from it. Monica opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, perhaps to wound him one last time, but he did not let her. No more. His voice was not loud. It was final. She stopped. In the morning, he said, you will speak to Harold, not to me. You will not enter this room again without being asked. You will not touch my documents, my accounts, or my medical files. Whatever this marriage was, it is finished. Monica stood in the lamplight, beautiful and furious, and suddenly less powerful than she had ever allowed herself to appear. For the first time, Ethan saw plainly that much of her authority in this house had depended on one simple assumption, that he was too sick, too hurt, too lonely to act. The moment that assumption died, so did a great deal of what she had mistaken for control. Her voice, when it came, was colder than before. You were making a mistake. No, Ethan said, I made a mistake when I kept believing you were still my wife. The sentence landed with the quiet force of a locked door. For several seconds, Monica did not move. Then she reached for the back of the chair she had abandoned earlier, as though to steady herself, and seemed to think better of it. Pride won. Pride always did with her. Fine, she said at last. If this is how you want it. Ethan did not answer. She looked at him one more time, perhaps expecting some final flicker of hesitation, some appeal, some sign that the man in front of her still feared being alone more than being betrayed. What she found instead was a stillness she no longer knew how to work around. Monica turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Ethan sat without moving for a long moment after she was gone. His hands still shook, his body still achd with the familiar exhaustion that no amount of money had ever managed to buy away. None of that had changed. Yet something fundamental had. On the desk beside Harold's folder lay Annie's drawing, the small crayon sun still smiling over a room it had never really seen. Ethan reached for it with his left hand and unfolded it completely. The paper was cheap, the lines were uneven, the colors bled past their edges. It was in every possible way a child's work, and somehow it was also the cleanest thing left in his life. Outside the window, the night had deepened over the estate, cold and dark and stripped bare. But inside the room, with the echo of Monica's footsteps already fading into the long machinery of the house, Ethan Caldwell understood that some endings did not arrive to destroy a man. Some arrived to return him to himself. Morning arrived at the Caldwell estate with the cold, clear brightness that often followed a hard night. The sky over Westchester was pale and unforgiving, the kind of winter light that revealed everything without warming any of it. Frost silvered the back terrace railings, and the bare branches beyond the lawn stood still against a white blue sky. Inside, the house moved carefully around its own tension. Staff spoke in lower voices than usual. Doors were opened and closed with extra caution. Even the clink of china at breakfast seemed subdued, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreversible had been decided upstairs. Ethan Caldwell had not slept much, but he did not feel hollow the way he had on other nights. Exhausted, yes, shaken, yes. His right hand still trembled with the same stubborn rhythm, and his body still carried the weight of illness in every simple movement. But beneath that, something had settled. The decision made the night before had not lessened the pain. It had only given the pain direction. Harold Whitmore arrived just after 8. Marlene brought him through the private sitting room entrance again, this time without needing instructions. She knocked once, opened the door, and stepped aside. Harold entered, carrying a leather folder in a smaller black case, his expression grave but unsurprised. He had likely spent the early morning drafting the first clean outlines of war. Good morning, he said. There's nothing good about it, Ethan replied. Harold took the chair opposite him. That usually means it's worth doing. On the desk between them lay the folded child's drawing, the linen napkin, and the first stack of legal papers Harold had sent over the day before. Ethan had not moved any of them. The drawing remained brightest among them all, a patch of crooked crayon sunlight in a room that had seen too little mercy and too much truth. Harold opened his folder. I had the divorce filing drafted before dawn. It can be submitted today. I also reviewed your estate structure in full. There are immediate changes we can initiate this morning, and there are broader trust revisions that will require your signature and witness certification. Ethan glanced at his hand. That may be more difficult than it used to be. I've made arrangements for that. Harold's voice was practical, steady. You sign what you can. Where necessary, we document condition, intent, and execution carefully. No one will be able to challenge clarity. That mattered more than Ethan expected it to. Clarity. For months, his illness had made other people talk around him, over him, for him. Today, every word, every line, every mark would be his. Harold slid the first document forward. This removes Monica from your immediate medical and financial authority pending full dissolution. Ethan read it slowly, line by line, while Harold waited without hurrying him. His eyes felt tired, but his mind remained sharp. When he reached the bottom, he nodded once. Good, he said. Next. The second document dealt with trust access, the third with shared holdings, the fourth with residence terms during the filing period. By the time Ethan reached the section outlining revisions to his principal estate distribution, Harold paused. This, the lawyer said, resting one hand lightly on the page, is where I need you to be absolutely certain. Ethan looked up. Harold's expression softened by only a degree. I understand what the child has meant to you. I understand gratitude. I understand moral clarity. But what you are asking for is not symbolic. It is substantial. Once executed, it will alter the future, not just of your wife, but of everyone expecting your wealth to follow a predictable line. Ethan turned his eyes to the page again. The numbers did not move him. Money had stopped feeling abstract to him long ago, but it had also stopped feeling sacred. He knew what it could do, what it could buy, what it could shield, and what it could corrupt. He knew, too, how often it traveled toward the coldest hands simply because those hands were nearest when death arrived. He had spent years building an empire. He no longer mistook inheritance for virtue. When I could no longer hold a spoon, he said slowly. Everyone who said they loved me stepped back. Harold said nothing. Ethan looked toward the folded drawing, then back to the document. The only hands that reached for me were hers. The room went quiet. Harold had known Ethan a long time, long enough perhaps to understand that this was not sentimentality. It was judgment, a moral judgment, sharper than any financial one. At minimum, Harold said carefully, the asset transfer should be placed into a protected structure. Annie Bennett is a child. The management must be insulated from outside pressure, publicity, and opportunists. Do it. And Rosa. Ethan thought for a moment. Rosa receives immediate protection independent of Annie's trust, housing, income security, and educational control. She is not to be left vulnerable because her daughter was kind to me. Harold nodded and made a note. That is easier to defend. I'm not interested in easier, Ethan said. I'm interested in right. For the first time that morning, Harold allowed himself a brief, humorless smile. You always were. Marlene arrived 10 minutes later with 2 witnesses from Harold's office and a small tray of coffee Ethan would not drink. The signing took time, more time than it should have. His hand shook badly on the first page, forcing him to pause and brace his wrist with his left hand. The signature came out uneven, but it was his. On the second document, the tremor worsened and anger flashed through him so suddenly he nearly pushed the papers away. Harold's voice remained calm. Take your time. Ethan inhaled slowly and tried again. By the fourth signature, sweat had broken at his temples despite the chill in the room. His fingers ached with the effort of control, yet each completed line gave him back a sliver of something illness had been taking for months. Authorship, not over his body. That war remained unfinished, but over the meaning of what remained to him. When the last witness signed and the final folder was closed, Harold leaned back and exhaled. It's done. Ethan sat still for a moment, looking at the stack of executed papers as if they belonged to someone steadier. Good. Monica will be served this afternoon. Let her be. Harold studied him. And Annie. At the sound of the child's name, Ethan's expression changed in a way no lawyer's caution could miss. Fatigue softened into something gentler. Ask Marlene to bring Rosa to me, he said. And if Annie is here, she comes too. It took 12 minutes. When Rosa entered the sitting room, Annie's hand was tucked into hers. Both of them had clearly come in some uncertainty. Rosa's face carried worry, carefully concealed beneath composure. Annie's carried no concealment at all. She looked from Ethan to Harold to the folders on the desk and then back to Ethan with open concern. Mr. Caldwell, Rosa said quietly. Ethan nodded toward the chairs opposite him. Please sit down. Rosa obeyed, though every line of her body suggested she expected bad news. Annie remained standing beside her chair. Are you okay? The little girl asked at once. The question moved through the room like warm air. Ethan looked at her and for the first time in longer than he could measure, answered without pretending. I think I am beginning to be. Annie seemed satisfied with that for the moment. Rosa was not. Sir, she said carefully. If this is about Annie going where she shouldn't, it isn't. Ethan interrupted gently. Then he glanced at Harold, who opened the thinner folder and placed one page before Rosa. What is this? She asked. A beginning, Ethan said. Rosa looked down at the page, then up again, confusion deepening. Annie, too young to understand legal language, leaned closer only to see her own name printed in clear black letters. Why is my name there? She asked. Ethan held her gaze. His hand was still trembling on the arm of the chair, but his voice did not. Because, he said, in the worst days of my life, you did not turn away. Rosa's eyes widened as understanding began to arrive in pieces too large to take all at once. Mr. Caldwell, he stopped her with the smallest movement of his left hand. This is not charity, he said. And it is not payment. No amount of money can pay for what your daughter gave me. But I can decide what kind of heart my life will honor when I'm gone. Rosa stared at him, tears rising before she seemed ready to allow them. Sir, that's too much. No, Ethan said, it is the first thing in this house that has felt measured correctly in a very long time. Annie looked from one adult to the other, understanding only that something serious and tender was happening. Then, with the steady certainty of childhood, she crossed the room and stood beside Ethan's chair. He looked at her. She reached for the folded napkin on the table, picked it up with both hands, and placed it carefully nearer to him as though setting one small thing right. I'm glad you're not alone today, she said. Ethan Caldwell looked at the child, at Rosa through her tears, at the signed papers on his desk, at the crayon son smiling from the folded drawing nearby, and understood that justice did not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it came quietly through a lawyer's pen, a woman's raised child, and a little girl who had once seen a hungry man in a fine room, and decided that was reason enough to walk toward him. Outside, the winter light lay clear across the Caldwell estate, touching stone, glass, and bare branches alike. Inside, for the first time in many months, Ethan did not feel like a ghost waiting in his own house. He felt, despite the tremor, despite the loss, despite the long road still ahead, like a man whose life had finally stopped rewarding the wrong people. The story reminds us that true character is revealed not in times of comfort but in moments of weakness. Wealth, status, and appearances may attract people, but only genuine kindness stays when dignity begins to fall apart. It also teaches that betrayal often comes quietly. While compassion can come from the most unexpected person, in the end, the story tells the audience that love without loyalty is empty and that sometimes the purest form of justice is choosing to honor the one who stood by you when everyone else turned away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.